But what is philosophical progress to your mind?
I think it's not about whether there's one or many gods as such. It's about the type of questions that are being addressed in that religious tradition and the kind of attitude that's taken towards the relationship between man and the divine.
Trying to solve the problems posed by technology, I think, is a more urgent problem than dealing with the legacy problems of superstition and authoritarianism inherited by religion, because I think if we don't solve the new and emerging problems, the old ones will get worse.
It'll be harder to solve these new problems precisely because of these old problems that haven't gone away. So I see them as bound together.
I am not virtue nor vice, not pleasure or pain. I need no mantras, no pilgrimage, no scriptures or rituals. I am not the experience nor the object of experience, not even the one who experiences. I am the form of consciousness and bliss. I am Shiva. I am Shiva, that which is not. That was a verse from the Nirvana Shatakam, a 9th century Hindu chant attributed to the founding father of Advaita Vedanta, Adi Shankara, which summarizes the non-dual nature of the divine according to this school of Hindu philosophy. The English translation was sourced from the Isha Foundation. Welcome back to the second episode of the Long Count podcast. It is my delight to welcome today's guest, writer, YouTuber, host of the Science of Everything podcast, and published author, James Fodor. Welcome to you, James.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
James is a neuroscience graduate student at the University of Melbourne and co-founder of Effective Altruism Melbourne, with wide-ranging interests across philosophy, science, history, and related fields. An atheist and proponent of critical thinking, he is an author of 2018's Unreasonable Faith, How William Lane Craig Overstates the Case for Christianity, a critique of the influential Christian apologist and philosopher William Lane Craig's magnus opus, Reasonable Faith, originally published in 1994. So James, the title of today's discussion, as you're aware, is God's Existence. Is it the right question? When I first emailed you about this, what were the first feelings you had toward that question? And is it one that you had considered yourself? Because obviously this has been a huge part of your career. Was there a time at the outset? I know you had a religious background initially.
Yes.
But was there a time at which you began to assess the value of the question itself? And how has that fed into your investigation of all things religious?
Well, the God question has always been of personal interest to me, probably in part because of my own religious upbringing, as you mentioned. I'm also interested in different ways of thinking about the world and different, perspectives on reality, I suppose, and religion is certainly one, a major one of those. But I've also thought a fair bit over the years about the significance of the God question, particularly in the present day in the West, because there are a lot of people who don't think this question is very interesting or relevant anymore. They may see religion as an important social phenomenon, but in fact, it's not uncommon if I talk to other people in rationalist spaces or scientists and such, or even philosophers who can recognize the social or cultural importance of religion, but find it difficult to understand why anyone would take the question of God's existence or nature very seriously as an actual, intellectual problem or issue to consider. So, that's got me to reflect. And funnily enough, many religious people also don't think of that as a significant question to discuss because they also take the answer for granted. So that's, those sort of attitudes have got me thinking over the years about whether it is worth spending the time and the energy on this sort of question, like writing a book about it, for example. And I mean, overall, I guess I've come to the conclusion that it is an important question, even in our largely sort of secular age, at least in the West. I don't think it's the only important question by any means, but I do think it still matters.
So just for the purposes of tonight's discussion, I'm just using the shorthand, the God question, to refer to the question of whether a personal monotheistic God exists. That could be the God of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, or any other monotheistic religion. However, we could also consider alternatives. There are questions related to the God question, obviously. Are there plural gods? Is a God a person? Is another question. All these questions within theology. And just for the listeners, a brief outline of the contours of the discussion this evening. We're going to start by asking James to provide an initial answer to my question, as we've just explored there a little bit, and then I'm going to follow up by hearing his reasoning. We'll then turn to the value of the God question, both in the past and for our present period. We'll then explore the connection between religion and epistemology, that is, the philosophy of knowledge. We'll discuss the social consequences of religious belief, and ask whether Godhood or God-making is a useful metaphor or analogy for artificial general intelligence. We'll then return to this meta question. What is the value of asking the God question or of prioritizing it over other major questions? So there's a comparative dimension here as well. Do you think there are questions worthier of humanity's consideration, either in terms of urgency, fruitfulness, or fundamentality? And I might tack on there as well, to what extent is this a question relevant for majorities or as compared with minorities? Many people today seem to think this is a question just for the religious or just for philosophers, but perhaps not relevant to every person. So what is your thought on that? Are there worthier questions for humanity's consideration as such? And is this a question for, is a worthy question for everyone or just for certain minorities?
So I think the best way to think about this is in terms of prioritization, because it's not a binary issue of do we investigate one question completely or not at all. It's sort of how would you prioritize things. Mm-hmm. And so if you ask me to sort of rank order in order of pressingness and importance, the various questions, scientific, philosophical, and otherwise, that I think humanity faces, I don't know exactly where I would put the God question. I mean, I think it would be in the top 100. I probably wouldn't be in the top 10. So I think it's important, but I don't think it's of overwhelming importance. Now, of course, I mean, I know this is one of your later questions. How important you think the God question is partly depends on what you think the answer to the God question is, although it's not quite so simple as people who believe in God think it's the most important question. It depends on some subsidiary points as well. But
whether I may interject also the reasonableness of believing you can have an answer to the question.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, there are a variety of issues that will affect one's answer here. But yeah, so in short, I think it's an important but not an overriding important question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. And it's becoming fashionable at the moment, I think partially is the influence of Jordan Peterson and his associates, to consider the alternative question of, do you act as if God exists, or is it worth acting as if God exists? I believe, I may be mistaken, but I believe that there are a variety of religious people, especially those of the politically conservative persuasion, who think that that is in some sense a more fundamental question of, do you act as if God exists, or do you act in relation to the values which God represents? As an atheist, does that kind of question make any sense to you? I mean, do you consider yourself a cultural Christian? Do you act as if God exists? And what, if anything, does that mean?
Yeah, well, this sort of cultural religiosity or cultural Christianity does seem to become more influential in recent years. So I think in addition to Jordan Peterson, whose actual views on the sort of metaphysical question are notoriously obtuse, but nevertheless sort of thinks Christianity is an important cultural force. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is another example of someone who appears to have converted to, well, some form of Christianity for largely political and cultural reasons, and not, at least seemingly not for sort of traditionally theological or experiential reasons. And there are others I know in sort of similar situations. So it absolutely does seem to be a real phenomenon. Now, personally, I am quite... I have quite negative views towards this use of religion, or this attitude towards religion. I mean, there's a lot to say about that, but broadly speaking, I hold the view that one should strive for consistency and honesty in one's belief in how one lives out one's life. And so the idea that one doesn't truly, in some sense, believe in the metaphysical claims of a religious tradition, but nevertheless endorses it for some personal or social reason, strikes me as being in quite bad faith, and I think potentially has a lot of downsides. Now, maybe some people can live that out. I don't want to say that it's impossible, but I certainly don't think that it's something... I don't have any personal interest in that, and I would be quite critical of that. So I think that what we can do is learn what can be learned from religious traditions. And I think nearly every religious and philosophical tradition that's had any influence over the history of humanity has something that we can learn from. some more than others, of course, and some degree of adaptation might be needed to fit that to a modern day. I absolutely think that that's important, and I think that we should strive to be open to challenges to our worldview from those who hold different views. So I'm on board with all of that, but that's rather different from saying that we should hold a sort of a very pragmatic attitude towards religion and kind of separate what I might call the metaphysical questions from the political or social import of the religious beliefs. I find that very difficult.
So God does exist as a psychological reality. People believe in God, and he has a psychological existence for them. And of course, there are different varieties of gods which exist. So the gods do exist at a psychological level, and that has profound social consequences.
Yeah, so
in some sense, you and I do both act. Everyone acts, and I think this is the insight of the psychologizing of religion by the psychoanalysts and their successors, is that we all have to acknowledge that we live in a world populated by gods, at least in terms of their psychological reality, their archetypal reality in people's consciousness, in people's worldviews. People have what we might now call a parasocial relationship with fictional or divine entities. They worship them. And so we live in a world with gods in this psychological sense. I mean, there's even the question of why should the question of God's existence take priority over how to live in a world with a variety of beliefs? The psychological God, the God that exists in the culture, that is real. Why not focus on that as opposed to asking the bigger question? If one is approaching, let's say, from a secular or atheistic standpoint. And I suppose associated question here is there a danger of polytheism or a polytheistic psychology? It seems to me that a lot of Christians and monotheists in general, one of the things I'm most proud of is graduating out of polytheism so they can worship a coherent, unified set of values associated with the one God as opposed to many values. Is there a psychological danger to the atheist or the secularist in disbelieving in a monotheistic God that they will somehow associate with a polytheistic psychology or live polytheistic, let's say? Goes back to the question of acting as if God exists. If you act as if God does not exist, do you become a de facto polytheist in some sense because you're navigating in a world, an environment full of all these different gods, so to speak, these subpersonalities, these archetypes, these cultural icons? Do you end up in a godless world, or do you end up in a world of many gods once you become an atheist?
Well, in the sense that any being or idea that has a sufficient adherence exists in that psychological, sort of sociological sense. I mean, in that sense, we all live in a polytheistic world, regardless of what we believe. I think that there is a danger. I'm not sure I'd phrase it as sort of becoming polytheistic, but there is a danger, I think, for some people who lose religious faith or perhaps never had it in the first place, that they substitute other beliefs for that, which may be, from my point of view, either even less defensible, like even less rationally defensible, and or more harmful. Mm. So certain New Age beliefs, for example, I think are of equal sort of poor epistemic defensibility as well as sort of social harm as conservative Christian or Muslim beliefs. And some of the people who believe them, it's sort of interesting enough, may feel like, I think this is potentially the danger, they feel themselves as having escaped the traditional dogmatic religious systems of monotheism, but may have fallen into equally constraining dogmatic systems of their own, even using the language of sort of diversity and opposition to traditional religious authority. And I think that is a real danger, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's just really important to have a sort of grounded, thought through worldview. Obviously, people have different amounts of time and inclination for such a thing, but to sort of think through what you believe and why you believe it and how things fit together, and not just rely on sort of social and political conveniences about what to believe, because I think that can lead you into all sorts of movements or practices which can ultimately be harmful. Mm.
There's, of course, there's an idea that religious people sometimes throw around that everyone worships something. And it's this idea that what you pay most attention to or what you prioritize is what you quote unquote worship. And here, worship is just basically conflated with value or prioritize. But also, I think it's an irrational idea because you could have someone who is, say, addicted from past trauma, and it's not as if they're worshipping a substance, it's just that they're relying on it as a coping mechanism for something. So it's this whole how you act tells us what religious belief you have thing is quite a sinister idea, I think, especially when you consider that it is pretty totalitarian in its implications. I mean, we could just observe everyone and construct a character profile for them, we could almost decide for people what their worldviews and values are, what gods they worship, if you will. So, but what have we learned from asking the God question historically? Has exploring the question of God's existence contributed to philosophical or psychological progress in your view? And I also want to add there, do you think that in some sense monotheism is a progressive step from polytheism? Is there growth in our capacity for reasoning, or is there something important for psychology in that transition?
I'll take the second question first. So I have maybe, I don't know how hot a take it is, a little bit of a hot take perhaps about that. I do think that monotheistic, well, there's a caveat here, but I'll say it first without the caveat. I do think that monotheistic belief systems are, in a sense, a step forward from polytheistic belief systems. This is a bit of an old-fashioned view, which would sort of characterize more sort of primitive belief systems of, say, nature worship, which are predominant and mostly in like stateless societies. And then societies, as they become more developed, are more likely to embrace monotheistic belief systems. I mean, this is sort of the argument of Christianity, or at least like Islam in the Middle East. Now, the caveat there is I don't actually think that monotheism is doing the work here, because I think that you have similar sort of effects in India with Hinduism, which is not, at least in many forms, is not monotheistic. I mean, there are monotheistic variants, but also in China with Buddhism and sort of Taoism. So I don't actually think, and those are, but Buddhism is in some sense an atheistic religion. But the point is, I don't think it's the monotheism as such that's doing the work there. What I think the step forward lies is the systematization and organization of spiritual or religious belief around a set of specified practices and specified beliefs, where there's a sort of organized ritual, there's sort of hierarchies, and there's organized theological, philosophical work that goes into making sense of it and trying to understand it. I mean, a lot of traditional religious, like traditional Greek and Roman gods, for example, kind of just a hodgepodge of stories and bizarre personalities, which then, philosophically minded people started to think about and discussed, this doesn't really make very much sense if we interpret it all literally. And so we have to then sort of reinterpret the mythology and understand how to make sense of that. And at least it seems to be an empirical case that many societies have moved away from those types of sort of traditional polytheism or nature worship into more organized, systematized, and often universalized salvific religions. So that includes Christianity, Islam, and at least many forms of Buddhism, and some forms of Hinduism as well. And I think that universalization is actually important. Instead of having one local god who sort of serves our purposes and we try to placate them and then avoid their wrath and things like that, which is often a very traditional sort of religious perspective, we actually have a credos which specifies our relationship to the divine in a broader cosmic sense, of humanity's relationship to the divine or to the transcendent. And we have a sort of a theory about why we're here and what we're trying to achieve, or what God is trying to achieve with us or through us or something. And I think that in some sense does represent progress, in the sense that instead of thinking about ourselves in a pure particularist sense of trying to live, instead of thinking about gods in a transactional sense, like we make these offerings or sacrifices or whatever, and God gives us good things, and if bad things happen, he must be mad at us. That's, I think, a very crude and primitive way of thinking about the relationship of humanity with the divine or transcendent. Instead of that, we think more about it in terms of what the nature of reality is and goodness and the man's ultimate destiny and things like that, which I think are much more important questions. And well, I mean, you have to eat and survive at a basic level. Like, there are steps one takes to get to that level. But when society reaches a certain point of sophistication, it's important to start asking those questions. And so I do think of that as somewhat of a step forward. But yeah, hopefully I've clarified that I think it's not about whether there's one or many gods as such. It's about the type of questions that are being addressed in that religious tradition and the kind of attitude that's taken towards the relationship to man and the divine. Of course, individuals within religious traditions can have all sorts of personal opinions or reasons why they're religious. I'm more talking about the the sort of theology and practice of the belief system as a whole, not necessarily individuals within it.
Yeah, so the fact that religious traditions and theological traditions are tied up with scientific and philosophical and cultural progress is not necessarily a strong argument for them when you consider that, for instance, all around the world, astronomy was tied up intimately with astrology for the vast majority of human history. And it's easy to understand psychologically how you would be more motivated to study the stars if you thought they could influence harvests and people's destinies and the rise and fall of kings, etc. It would motivate you to develop more sophisticated means of tracking their movements and all the rest. But let's take a step back here, because I want to know, your answer there seemed to imply that you think that the quality of religious questions, or at least the concerns of theologians, have progressed or improved. And I tend to share that impression, certainly since the second half of the 20th century. But what is philosophical progress to your mind? And how does it differ from spiritual, psychological, or scientific progress?
Right. Well, I mean, this relates to your first question about whether what we've learnt in asking the God question, or what progress has been made on that. And I mean, that's very hard to assess, precisely because it's hard to define what we even mean by philosophical progress. Some people who are more skeptical about the notion of philosophical progress point to the fact that many of the same questions that were asked by the ancient Greeks or ancient Indian philosophers we still ask today, like the nature of right and wrong, and how we justify knowledge and things like that. But I personally think that there has been substantial philosophical progress, both over long and like thousands of years and sort of shorter horizons of the last few decades. But that philosophical progress doesn't take the form of resolving the big questions such that everyone now agrees what the answer is. There may be a handful of cases where that's true, but for the most part, it is not. But that doesn't mean that there can't be progress. I think that we have a lot more to say now, let's say, than we did 2,000 years ago as a species about, say, the nature of right and wrong, how they might be justified, what things constitute good and bad behavior, and what it is about morality that's sort of distinctive from other things that animals do, or other sort of spheres of human existence. The notion of universal, well, I was going to say here, the notion of universal human rights, although I do have some sort of technical issues with rights talk as such, but the broad notion of sort of the fundamental equality of moral status of human persons, a fairly recent development in human history, I think is a very significant one. Sort of took us a surprisingly long time to get there. But I think that reflects the difficulty inherent to the human condition in thinking universally and abstractly, rather than locally and in particular terms of our tribe, our family, or our local group and things like that. So that's an example of a very significant achievement, which I think has been assisted, or at least been bound up in, certain religious and theological developments, as I said, the universalizing religions, though I don't think it's restricted to those, which is why it's hard to answer the question, answering the God question, like how much progress have we made, or how has that helped us? Because it's hard to know what the counterfactual would be of a society where the God question was never addressed in a significant way, and what sort of progress would have been made there. Perhaps Chinese tradition would provide the closest example, because the theological discussions of the sort that monotheists have focused on are a bit different to those that interested in the Chinese tradition. It's still not a perfect comparison, because they still had a lot of beliefs that I would call sort of mystical and spiritual. But at any rate, I think it's hard to disassociate particularly because prior to the Enlightenment, there was so much, almost all intellectual inquiry was mixed to some degree with religious inquiry or underlying beliefs about the creator or the Bible or something like that. So it's hard to dissociate the two, but I do think that over time there has been philosophical progress, and in part that has been driven by or gone along with people's interest in understanding the nature of God or understanding humanity's relationship to God. And so in that sense, I think we can say there's been progress in the God question.
Well, I tend to define philosophical progress as basically the inverse of scientific progress. Science being the discipline of finding better answers to increasingly specific questions. Philosophy being the process of finding better questions to typically that focus typically on general topics. And I think in that sense, there has clearly been philosophical progress.
Yes.
And that has arisen in part out of the religious and theological traditions. Although the question of its relationship to psychological development or maturity is a very complicated one. I mean, there's a question of how much thinking about religion in general or relating to ideas of divinity or gods is itself psychologically adaptive, useful, etc. Something to come back to at a later stage. So I think it's clear. I think it's relatively straightforward that we have learned from asking the God question historically. But of course, one of the major purposes of particularly the Western religions, and especially Christianity, is to do with the foundation for ethics, attempting to ground a foundation for ethics. So does asking the God question or engaging with theological debates as you have things like the moral argument for God's existence help us understand the nature of good and evil itself?
Do you mean at the individual level or at a societal level?
Both, either or.
Yeah. Well, because at a societal level, I think the answer is clearly yes. I mean, that's more or less part of what I was saying previously. At the individual level, well, that's a lot more variable. I think it has for me, that is, in being challenged by both religious and irreligious people to articulate what the basis of morality is, or what distinguishes right and wrong, and what it looks like to live a good life, and things like that. I definitely think that I have learnt a lot about the nature of morality and ethics, and have been motivated to do more to live a good life than I otherwise probably would have if I hadn't been challenged in that way. But I don't know that that's a universal or even a very common experience. I mean, that's more of an empirical question, to be honest. I think a lot of people end up in a position where they're just sort of satisfied with what they think about morality broadly and then don't give much further thought. And in that sense, it's maybe not very challenging for them, regardless of what their exact position is. And I think that that's where the social and political aspects can be detrimental, is because if you sort of end up in a particular in-group, enculturated into thinking about things in a particular way, and you don't necessarily challenge each other to think differently or to do better and to live better. Not saying that that's always the case. It very much depends on the group, but I think that can very much happen. So I don't know that asking the God question or exploring that necessarily helps one to live better or to understand morality better. I think in some cases it doesn't really make much difference, and there are plenty of people who know a lot about morality or have thought a lot about it, or who live very well who've never really thought much about the issue. So yeah, I don't know that I have a particular position on whether that helps at the individual level. I mean, I think it can help, but only for people, with the right mindset, I think.
Yeah, so let's get down to basics here. This is very interesting. I believe that I overvalued the importance of the God question in the past in terms of its existential significance, and specifically with respect to its relationship to conscience. I am politically anti-theistic still, but existentially and on a psychological level, I'd say I'm existentially agnostic in terms of I try and live in accordance with my conscience as best I can. And I try and refine my conscience such that it's a reflection of the best parts of the culture, the superego, as Freud would call it, but not just the best parts of the present culture. I try and refine my conscience and live in accordance with it, almost indifferent to the question of God or the existence of a God or multiple gods. Although this is becoming increasingly difficult with the advent of AI, because it is almost as if there are superhuman or post-human entities emerging. This is something we're going to discuss later in the episode, but it does make, I think, these questions traditionally consigned to theology will take on a new significance, I believe, in our era, in a way which is not without precedent. I mean, astrology becomes astronomy, alchemy becomes chemistry, and I wonder, is it possible that secularization will cause theology to follow philosophy by branching off into subdisciplines which eventually become their own sciences? So, for instance, regenerative medicine in place of soteriology, in place of questions of salvation, we have questions of life extension, lifespan, health span extension. Risk analysis in place of eschatology, So instead of thinking about apocalypse, we think about rare high impact events and so on. And is there a danger in the transformation of these traditionally religious questions and pursuits into scientific quests? This is a theme which Jung was very preoccupied with toward the end of his life, and I think it's a very timely one for us.
Yeah, well, I don't know too much about what Jung had to say on the subject. I have a pretty strong view about the future of philosophy, I guess, and I include theology there, which is that I think I think the ultimate objective of philosophy should be to eliminate itself, and by that I simply mean to transform. I see philosophy as a sort of residual of questions which we have insufficient understanding of to apply a rigorous and agreed upon sort of set of methods for problem solving in the way that we do in the sciences. And once we establish that.
May I just interject here? There's an interesting parallel, between theology and philosophy here. They both seem to progress via negativa, by removing extraneous or less well-formulated or less relevant topics. So there does seem to be a parallel there to some extent. But anyway, go on.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess you'd have to talk to some theologians or other religious people to get their perspective on how they see the progress of theology. But because of my particular perspective on, I guess, the metaphysical claims made by religion, I tend to think that eventually, as we make sufficient progress and as the project of the Enlightenment continues to play out, as optimistic as that might sound, I think that ultimately theology will become sort of redundant and irrelevant as a discipline. We'll still study it for historical interest, of course. Just like, because I don't think that there's ultimately a subject matter to study. I mean, of course, there's a subject matter to study insofar as you mentioned earlier that gods and spirits exist in a social sense because people still believe in them, although I think that will diminish over time, but there'll still always be some people who believe. So that aspect will still continue. But I mean, I think we can call that religious studies or sociology of religion or something like that, which isn't quite the same as theology. But I think theology, lacking a subject matter that exists outside of humans, will ultimately cease to exist as an independent discipline. And any of the sort of existential questions or issues of creation or morality or whatever else people have historically explained through religious narratives or by appealing to religious concepts will have explanations in elsewhere and ultimately in scientific disciplines. So that's a fairly bold claim. I realize a lot of people think that there's sort of an ultimate separation between some questions like morality or existential issues that are sort of forever outside the bounds of science. But I have a broader notion of what counts as science, but I also have a fairly strong view about what ultimately can be naturalized and therefore studied scientifically.
So do you have a definition of evil that you're comfortable with? And do you agree that it is more of one of the criticisms of Christianity and of monotheistic religion in general is it describes the world as a place of conflict between the forces of good and evil. Whereas my view as a philosopher is I think the two are very unalike. I think good is very multiplicious and diverse and not necessarily antagonistic toward evil, except that it's not the same. Whereas evil has a homogeneous quality because of how I define it, and I define it as the purposeful destruction of creative potential. So if I were to chop your arm off, let's say, you might think that the evil is contained in the act of chopping the arm off or the actual arm that is chopped off. But for me, what makes the act evil as opposed to just bad is the fact that I'm depriving you of all the possible future activities you could have done with that arm. And so it is not just the object that is destroyed or the act. It's not the perpetrator or the victim, but the potential which is harmed, which to me is intrinsic to the definition of evil. And in that sense, I don't think good and evil are fundamentally opposed. It's just good is. You can think of good in the terms of goods and services. Like you have all kinds of good music and good foods you like, but they're not opposed to the bad, to poison. It's not like all the good foods and poison are like locked in a war. Evil is antagonistic toward good, but good does not seem to me at any rate to be locked in a struggle with evil. And I don't know if the religious heritage is particularly useful. think, for instance, the myths in Genesis, or the apostles' parables and so on. I don't know if they are particularly useful in understanding evil. But yeah, I just wanted to know if you've had a definition you felt comfortable with.
Evil is not something that I think very much about. I don't personally find it to be a very useful concept. I mean, I'm open to being persuaded otherwise there, but I talk about good quite a lot in a similar sort of way to you, I think. I mean, there's many things we can describe as good and contributing to a good life, a good society. I think evil is not similarly a useful concept. And one of the reasons for that is because of, well, at least my sense of it is the very extreme nature of the way the term is used and deployed, say to describe a person or maybe a group, or an action. I think that people use the word evil often when they don't want to have to understand something about why it happened or why someone did that, and when they want to dissociate themselves completely. So a good example, of course, is Nazi Germany and Hitler, right, which is something that people would often describe as evil, and not without reason. But I think one of the problems with that language is that it is so extreme and kind of othering that it makes us feel like that's those things that happened, all those things that were done, the attitudes that were held, are things that only those evil people could do, or some kind of demonic forces somehow caused it to happen. I mean, not saying that one necessarily believes in that metaphysically, but it presents it puts it in a very different category than just people, than ordinary people making mistakes or having bad beliefs, which then self-radicalize and things like this. I mean, obviously, there's a lot to that situation to unpack, and it is extreme in certain ways. But I guess the point is, when we deploy the notions of evil, I think we make it harder for us to understand why things like that happen, and to critically reflect in ourselves and our own society as to what similar trends might exist, or are we partly in that direction, or what commonalities might we have, or why was that popular at the time, all these sorts of things. We just sort of write it off as, oh, that was evil. And of course, we never think of ourselves as evil, or generally the people we know. And so that is, I think, both makes it harder for us to understand, and as sort of an intellectual abdication of responsibility to understand, and then to hold ourselves, to a standard to avoid that. Now, I'm not saying that the concept of evil necessitates that you deploy it that way, but I think it has that risk because of, perhaps it's because of the religious tradition of, thinking of evil as sort of satanic and as being the utter opposite of God. God is perfectly good and Satan is like the ultimate evil. And there's not a lot of sort of nuance in that, or way that we can draw a direct connection to that in a way that there, I think, is in any real case of people doing things, where there's always a question of, what led them to do that? What are the social conditions, and on what conditions would you do different things? And there's more of a calling, I think, to us to think about that and understand it. So in broad terms, I would suggest that we don't really need a concept of evil, and we should adopt more nuanced language to understand horrific crimes and things that have happened throughout history. And maybe it's possible to rehabilitate evil and use it in a cautious way in certain very extreme for certain very extreme bad actions or actors. But I just personally don't see the need.
Well, you say, look, I mean, we both agree there's a major distinction between mildly bad things and severely bad things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so in some sense, I'm just using evil to refer to severely bad things, which is why I like the focus on the destruction of potential, because it is in those instances in which we regard things as being especially bad, it's because what is harmed or destroyed is not just an actual property, but future potential. Like, for instance, people always ask, why is it bad to kill someone? Obviously, part of the answer is you will prevent them from being alive. You'll prevent them from living the life that they would have lived, but you're also preventing them from living all the possible lives which they could have lived. Setting aside the free will debate, which I think is irrelevant to this, because people act voluntarily, even if not freely. Put that distinction to a side. I do think that the distinction between actuality and potentiality is very relevant for ethics. And again, people say the atheists, why their favorite question, why is it bad for you to kill someone if you don't believe in God? Well, I have a specific answer to this question. I think it's relevant because their answer is faith-based, but I think a wisdom-based answer is better. I think the reason it's wrong for me to kill someone is not because I know they are of divine worth or made in the image of God, but because I don't know how valuable their life is. And so it's my awareness of my ignorance which grounds my actions fundamentally in relation to other people. Just imagine you're in the First World War, you're in the trenches, and you're shooting at people. You have no idea, which lives. Are you going to shoot a Tolkien or are you going to shoot Hitler? You have no idea. And then there's a whole question, again, what makes war wrong? What made the First World War wrong? Well, it's not so much what we know it will do, it's what we don't know it will do. It's the risks which it entails and the value which we don't know is being destroyed. That is the real ethical concern. And so I think we can ground ethical intuitions in our awareness of our ignorance of the value of things. And to me, that is what divine worth means. If you want to make a distinction between the sacred and mundane, or the divine and the mundane, to me, very pragmatically, I would say that the mundane is that which is relatively calculable worth, and the sacred or the divine is a relatively incalculable. So I have no difficulty with that as an atheist, that the value of your life is sacred or divine, in as much as I don't know how much it's worth to you, to other people in the future, etc. I mean, you could be a really miserable son of a bitch, but you could stop a kid running into the road, and that kid you stopped running into the road turns out to be a super valuable person. So it's my awareness of my ignorance that can ground my belief. And I think that's a better basis for ethics than faith. That I shouldn't do something because it's God's divine IP. God says I shouldn't harm someone, so...
Well, I mean, I'm certainly in agreement there that entirely grounding morality in God's commands without further discussion about what grounds those commands or what status they have is very unsatisfactory. I think it's a very low stage of moral development if that's a level one reaches. I'm not sure that I agree with the idea that about the distinction between the mundane and sacred in terms of sort of calculability or knowability. To me, that seems to be valorizing ignorance in a way that I'm not sure I like, but perhaps I'm not quite understanding the thrust of your argument there.
Well, I think an easy way to understand my intuition here is to consider suicide. So you might have a wide variety of reasons for thinking that the world would be a content warning. We're going to discuss suicide for a second here from a philosophical perspective. You may have a variety of reasons for thinking that the world would be a better off place without you, and you may have an awful relationship with yourself such that you're filled with self-loathing. So you both make some kind of, you make some consequentialist account of how the world would be a better place without you, and you have a bad relationship with yourself, so you feel justified in committing suicide. But then there's also the relationship that you have with other people, and also your future potential. And you're ignorant of the value which you have to other people, and you're also ignorant of your future potential. And so the argument against suicide to me is very similar to the argument against killing. Both are based on your ignorance of the both actual and potential value which you have to other people and to the world at large, both at present and in the future. And I think I think ignorance is super important there.
Well, I mean, it is from a practical perspective, and I guess that's part of what we mean by potential, is that it's not actualized and therefore not knowable, at least in many cases. So I would say that...
I think it's one of the reasons, for instance, by the way, it's just to interject, that we tend to think killing younger people is worse than killing older people. It's not typically articulated, but part of the assumption is, well, we don't know what they could have been or done.
Yeah, I guess I personally would... I mean, I agree that the human potential is very important as a component of understanding right and wrong and the value of life and things like that. I wouldn't personally, and insofar as potential is non-actualized and therefore in some sense not known or even knowable, then it sort of relates to what you're saying. But I would say personally that it's not the unknowability as such that gives it importance. It's the future actualization of good states or desirable states, like relating to others, for example. Not whether we know that those will or not exist. Because if you somehow had perfect foresight, then I don't think that human potential would count for less, just because you sort of removed our veil of ignorance. So to me, it's not the ignorance that is important. It's the future value states themselves.
So this is really interesting, though, because removing that veil of ignorance is clearly dangerous, in as much as if we assess people's IQ and other genetic variables, we could make certain assumptions about them. Whether those assumptions turn out to be prejudicial or whether they turned out to be correct, they become self-fulfilling beliefs about how we treat those people. And so I think there is actually an immense value to this veil of ignorance, certainly historically, which is now potentially being threatened. I think it's interesting because this ignorance of the potential value of someone's life is a very solid rational foundation for ethics, which doesn't require much in the way of theorizing or argumentation or rationalization either. You can you're kind of awe-inspired at the immensity of your ignorance, and so you say, okay, I won't harm this person in an irreversible way or a severe way. But yes, if we could know more about the potential of people, when we do know more about them, and when we think we know more about them, if for ideological or other reasons, that knowledge can itself be dangerous. And this is where this ties into the whole theme of Genesis, right? The potential danger of knowledge. It's a really interesting theme in Christianity, isn't it? For the same religion which says, the truth shall set you free, it also has the knowledge of good and evil being the forbidden knowledge in the Garden of Eden. Yeah. I wonder if you think, yes, this question of ignorance and knowledge, well, I got to take a pause here. Implicit to this whole discussion is the common sense definition of wisdom, which I'm sure you know, which is awareness of your ignorance, or awareness of the extent of your ignorance. That's a popular definition of wisdom. And I think it's useful. Yeah, you're not comfortable with valorizing ignorance, and I suppose then you're not comfortable with my distinction between what is of divine worth, because I think there is a basic distinction there in terms of relatively calculable, relatively incalculable values, or relatively measurable, relatively immeasurable. Do you think that's a meaningful distinction? Is that a way of engaging with what religious people care about without retaining a belief in the supernatural?
Well, it's clearly a way, and I've heard sort of similar points being made, maybe in slightly different ways before. I guess I personally don't resonate with that very strongly. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons for this. One is because the notion of sort of measurability or knowability more generally, it
is modern, and I'm deliberately using calculability precisely
I don't have
because
an issue with that.
Precisely because our historical epoch is one in which prudence as a virtue takes on greater significance, which is why we see the rise of consequentialism, utilitarianism, etc. And especially if you're a large organization, you have lots of information or you have lots of power, you can know a lot, you can forecast a lot, and therefore you have to make decisions about what you can and can't calculate, what you should and shouldn't calculate, etc. And so awareness of ignorance, measurability, calculability takes on sorry, I just wanted to, because people may not know why I've used that term, but so.
That's I think that's fine, and that is an important insight about the importance of measurability and risk. It's always been important, but it's particularly important in the modern context, and probably will become increasingly important as society develops. But what I would say about that as a foundation for anything about morality or otherwise, or as a replacement for religion, is that it seems very relativistic to me, because what is measurable or even knowable is dependent on our current scientific and technological and philosophical developments, right? Things that were previously unknowable are now knowable, and there probably were many more things that we don't know now that we will, at some point in the future, figure out how, we'll determine how to know, or at least know a lot more about them. I'm not saying that we'll ever know everything, of course, but I don't know that there's any in principle, there's certain things that you can show are unprovable in formal disciplines, but speaking more generally, I don't know that there are very principled, specific limits to what our knowledge could be. It could always be forever expanding as we learn more and more, for all I know. And so for me, the idea that certain things, the division between calculable and incalculable, or knowable and unknowable, is not fixed. It's constantly moving. And for that reason, it's obviously of interest, because I think I value knowledge a lot, and I think that it's important to develop knowledge and to foster that. But it's not important from the point of view of making some sort of existentially important distinction between like the mundane and the transcendent, because that's really just what is measurable is really just a function of how much we've learned to know as a species or as individuals. And so for me, that's not what kind of marks a fundamental distinction of value.
Well, I'm trying to rehabilitate this phrase "divine worth" because I think it's a concession we can make to religious worldview that is meaningful. I do think that there is. In any case, I'd love to get into the weeds on that perhaps another time.
Yeah, sure.
But it's the interesting thing for me is a lot of the time, our ethical disposition has a lot to do with our well-being.
Yeah.
It's far easier to be benevolent if you're in a comfortable position.
Yeah, absolutely.
But before I turn on to the question of love, the question of knowledge is especially interesting because if you look at Gnosticism as a loose category term, the fundamental distinction between it and orthodox forms of religiosity, monotheistic religiosity, especially orthodox forms of Christianity, is that Gnosticism prioritizes the acquiring of some special tacit or mystical knowledge, the gnosis in question, as the path to salvation or enlightenment or transcendence or what have you, as opposed to following traditional interpretations or established authorities on scripture. That's a very, very loose distinction. And people, various authors, Jung and others, have described modernity as kind of taking a Gnostic term in terms of its valorization of knowledge and the rest. It's an interesting theme. Unfortunately, can't get into it too much here, but hopefully we'll return. So we read in the Christian Gospels that God is love. What is the relationship between love and rationality to your mind? And are either of them, love or rationality, a suitable substitute for God as society's guiding ideal?
This is an interesting question because rationality in particular is understood in different ways. And I'm not even sure myself which notions I prefer. I mean, there's a broad sense of rationality as, which could almost be understood as very similar to wisdom, which is something just like figuring out what to do or how to live in a very broad sense and knowing your limits and things like that. I don't know that definition is super helpful. There's a much narrower sense of rationality which treats it as means-ends analysis. So you set an objective and then so setting the objective, at least the very high level, is sort of irrational. It comes from somewhere or whatever. It's not subject to any rational constraints. Once you have that objective, then rationality is the process of achieving that objective within various constraints, or using the lowest resources or time or something like that. That's a very narrow definition of rationality. I'm personally maybe somewhere in between the very broad and the very narrow definitions of what rationality is. And so partly that how you conceive of rationality is going to then affect how you answer this question. I think if you take rationality to be almost similar to wisdom in a very broad way, like I think some philosophers do, then love is probably going to be an aspect of that, presumably because if you think that having some sort of positive pro-social regard for other people and animals is an important aspect of wisdom or sort of self-actualization as a person, then if you think rationality in a quite broad way, then you might think that sort of the rational person finds in themselves love for others, at least after reflection and acting in the world or something like that.
But what about love making you more rational, or being loving, or having a loving disposition?
Well, that would go the other way. I'm not really sure about that, to be honest. I guess, I hadn't thought so much about that. There are what I'll say is there are certainly a lot of people in the world who seem to be very loving as a disposition, as in having a strong regard for other people, caring deeply about them, showing empathy, and following that up with actions and doing a lot of things, who nevertheless I would not describe as very rational. I mean, lives of many Christian saints might come to mind in this. And I think that, as part of the effective altruism movement, for example, we have pretty strong views about the need to combine love as a sort of a feeling or pro-social attitude with pretty rigorous and careful epistemic practices so that we can channel, if you like, that love into ways that are actually helpful to other people. I think one can feel love and have genuine love and act it out, but in a way that is, in a sense, not rational, in not achieving the object of helping other people or doing good in the world or achieving your aims very effectively. Or sometimes you can even be counterproductive. You can actually be hurting people, but not realizing it. So I guess you might say that if you really care about others and are sufficiently introspective, you'll be driven to address those questions, like, am I really helping the poor or the needy, or am I just sort of fooling myself into thinking that I am? Mother Teresa is someone who's been criticized on this grounds about exactly what her motives were, and Christopher Hitchens has been very critical of her. And it's hard to assess people like that when you don't know, you can't see into their soul. But I think that ideally, love should press us to be more rational, to try to use the tools at our disposal to do the things that we're motivated to do to help others. And I'd say that that's what rationality is about, at least in part, is the sort of means ends analysis thing. That's at least part of it. And challenging yourself and rethinking positions and asking yourself what the evidence is, things like that. So, I mean, I think ideally there's an interaction between the two. I don't know if in practice that really happens very much, though.
You don't,
to be honest.
That's interesting, because in my experience, there's a very, very profound connection between the two.
How do you see that?
Well, first of all, I'll just recognize that you and I both clearly have a love of learning.
Yeah,
that is a passion. There's an emotion. There's an affective and emotional element to that. There's a joyfulness that comes from that. And there are various associated desires of helping people, etc., which, again, not totally selfless. I mean, there's a romance with history, with learning languages. I think look, okay. So it's obvious that being healthy is important for being rational. Obviously, if you are in very declining health, or if you're in a very bad psychological state, you'll find it hard to just think and function properly.
Yeah.
So in that generic sense, obviously in that generic sense, like health and rationality, but I think there's something specific about love, which is love and rationality are both combined by a sense of general openness, a kind of generous or compassionate curiosity about things and about the world, a sense of wonderment, a sense of enchantment or intoxication with life and with learning, a sense of inclusiveness, that you're just more open and willing to consider things in general. If you are hateful, spiteful, closed off, emotionally hurt, you can see how that restricts your range of interest. Now, I understand this is trespassing a little bit into the terrain of health, including mental health. But I do think that when I have been of a more loving disposition in general, I have had a greater openness, curiosity, willingness to engage, but also just psychological mental energy to do various activities. Things which would be a sacrifice or a burden become a passion, etc. So again, I mean, a cynic here could say we're just talking about health. This is about physical and psychological well-being. But I do think that there's something deeper and more profound here, because reason may not be the slave of the passions, as Hume said, but there is a strong relationship there. And I don't know about you, but for instance, for me, I have a great love of learning, of etymology and learning words in other languages that are novel concepts. That's a great love of mine. So love can be used in a variety of ways. But I think that the dissociation of rationality from love or from any other human feeling is certainly something people are afraid of, and for good reason. You can imagine like the hyper-rationality of algorithms or non-human entities making decisions without taking into consideration people's feelings could be very frightful. I can't explain it very well because it's a very experiential thing, but I'll just say that my being curious, pro-social, and having a loving disposition, I think enhances my rationality. And the opposite is also the case.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I'm not convinced that that's generally true of people. I mean, it may be true for some people. I think, I mean, there are interesting analogs from history, obviously, about heinous actions that have been pursued in some sense very rationally, although depending on how, again, depends how you deploy that word. But if you at least think of it in terms of, say, means ends analysis, you can think of, well, war is actually a good example of this. War has been described many times as sort of in some ways the pinnacle of human rationality, as well as the antithesis of human rationality. You think about all of the ingenuity that goes into devising more efficient means of killing and achieving battlefield objectives. And it's fascinating. I'm interested in the military history of war and the tactics and strategy. There's so much to learn. It's very interesting from that intellectual point of view.
And it informs game theory and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are also applications outside of it as well, which is interesting. But I guess from maybe a deeper point of view, it represents a failure of human rationality because every conflict has some endpoint, and the destruction that's wrought to achieve that endpoint is just a waste. It's a failure of human rationality to achieve some negotiated compromise that achieves that outcome without all the destruction that is wrought in the meantime, not to mention all of the poor reasons there are for war, such as mistrust and prejudice and greed and other things that are in some sense irrational. So, I mean, obviously there's a lot to unpack there in terms of the many aspects and the ways we're deploying the words there, but it seems to me that it's just very hard to pin down a particular relationship between love and rationality because of examples like war, where it seems on the one hand that you can describe them as supremely rational, and on the other hand, supremely irrational. And even in the case of war, in war we have great manifestations of love and also of hate, right? So it's, I don't know, it seems there's a lot going on there.
So okay, I'm going to go into it.
Well, we don't have to if you don't want to go there right now.
No. I'm just thinking if this is but no, I think it is because this doesn't get brought up enough. There is a kind of paradox of duality, or the paradox of non-duality, which is there's a theme in religious and philosophical discourses, this idea of duality, the body and the mind, the soul and the body, and so on, but also self and other. Assuming there are no other forms of like real duality, there is at least one form of duality we know exists without a doubt, and it's not the one that Descartes thought that, it is what I call the paradox of non-duality, which is that it is possible to simultaneously experience the world as being alien and distinct from you, and to have a non-dual awareness where, for instance, you just imagine this might sound a little hippie, but it's important to convey the affective, the qualia of the experience here. Imagine you're sitting outside and you're breathing in, and you hear the trees rustling, and you feel that what they're exhaling, you're inhaling, and vice versa, and you feel like you're one with the ecosystem. You're all a part of an organism, and I see you, and I see other people. And everyone appears to be a different face or manifestation of the universe. It's like you're identified with everything, and everything is a part of you. And so you have a sort of compassion or care for yourself, which is then extended to the rest of the world. That's one way of describing a non-dual experience. It can happen as a consequence of meditative states. It can happen under the influence of certain pharmaceuticals, psychedelics in particular. It can happen in experience of love between two people, for instance. Obviously, when people in love, the world seems to be kind of a brighter place, and people just kind of be spontaneously more benevolent. And there is this sense of an evaporation between the distinction between self and other. Ego consciousness becomes less of a burden. Things feel more spontaneous, free-flowing. Now, there's a pathological dimension. There's a pathological version of that, which Freud associated with this infantile regression to infantile consciousness, which he called a kind of oceanic experience, where you just can't differentiate between anything. Imagine someone is tripping off their mind, and they're just like, "I love you, man," is hugging strangers, all the rest. So there's a pathological variety of it, but there is also, I think, a profoundly rational aspect of it, which is to feel oneself not alienated from the world and from other people, and to see others and the world itself as in some sense a reflection of what is, to see in other things and other people a reflection of what you value about yourself. Now, the paradox of non-duality is it's possible to both go into that state and out of that state. And so I think that's associated with what I mean when I'm talking about this relationship between love and rationality, because, for instance, when you're depressed, isolated, anxious, especially when you're anything which can be described under the label alienated, it's very easy to view the universe as external, indifferent, dead, irrelevant, unrelatable, absurd, disinteresting, nihilistic, etc. And behaving callously, thoughtlessly, destructively with that emotional disposition comes naturally to you, and it can be quite irrational, both epistemically. It's epistemically irrational in the sense that you're having a distorted map of the universe, and it is instrumentally irrational in as much as it will harm your relationships with others and it will obstruct you achieving your goals. So perhaps that's something, perhaps that changes your mind a little.
Yes, I see what you're saying there. I guess one concern I have is that I don't think that we're restricted. Well, we shouldn't say we. I don't think that the two cases are simply of having generally pro-social positive attitudes towards people or maybe life in general, or versus the opposite of that you articulated as feeling withdrawn and cynical, disinterested, and negative, and so forth. At least in my reading of things, much of the challenge of human history is in othering, of having those positive attitudes towards one group of people and very negative attitudes combined with an element of negative attitudes and disinterest towards other groups of people. And I think that a lot of wars, discrimination, prejudice, and things are accounted for in that. And that's one of the reasons I'm a bit reticent about the saying anything very specific about the relationship between love and rationality, because I think, well, actually, there's a movie that came out very recently that sort of explored this issue in a way. In the case of the Holocaust, I'm trying to remember what A Zone of Interest is what it was called, where it portrays I don't know if you've heard about it, but it portrays a family life in terms of their children and home and things, home environment of the commandant of Auschwitz. And you don't actually see in the camp, but they're right next to it, and it explores this sort of duality of the love and evil in some ways, right? And the point is that I think that, humans do have this sort of dual aspect of where we can be very good in some contexts and very horrible in other contexts. And I don't know if you were to ask, well, which of those is sort of more rational? It depends how we're going to cash out the notion of rationality. But I don't know if I'm comfortable in saying just straightforwardly that it's always more comfortable, or it always is better, goes better for us or for our immediate circle when we adopt a broad pro-social attitude. Like sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes you'll be persecuted for fighting for what's right. And
history has lots of mystics with the kind of universal love, non-dual consciousness who end up getting persecuted.
Who haven't haven't done well for it. So I just think that there's a lot more to play there.
Well, it certainly seems if rationality becomes dissociated from yes, I suppose the question then becomes, to what extent can we generalize about love or dissociate it from things like pleasure or joy? But I do think, well, let me put it this way, because I'm trying to see what common ground exists between the religious and atheistic standpoint. And, if a religious person said to me, look, the feeling of love is associated with that which is of divine worth, I'd say, sure, we tend to love those things we regard as being of divine worth. If they said what is of divine worth is beyond our knowing, we can't know how valuable a human life is. Okay, So I think there are some fundamental intuitions, a part of the religious worldview, that makes sense at a lower level of resolution. The challenge comes when they become dogmatized and they take on a doctrinal form where all kinds of qualifications are put in there. But I think there are some fundamental intuitions amongst religious people that make a certain instrumental sense. It's one of the reasons people stay religious, I think, is, for instance, if you come from a loving family that also happens to be religious, that can be enough for some people to replicate the religion in the next generation. It's complicated. I'm not trying to reduce everything to kinship dynamics, but I asked, the second part of that question is, are either of them, rationality or love, a suitable alternative to God as society's guiding ideal? And this is interesting because, take for instance, the political ideal of meritocracy, We could say what makes someone meritorious is how useful they are to contributing to the social surplus. Or we could say what makes somebody meritorious is how caring their labor is. Or we could combine those two. There are a variety of ways of measuring economic performance. There are varieties of ways of measuring merit, some of which will be more economistic than others. And so this love and rationality, or care and rationality, or compassion and rationality as a pair of seeming opposites takes on an interesting political dimension. People who believe in God often, famously, there is the metaphor of God with the sun. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, God is like the sun. I can't look at him, but without him, I can't see anything. So it's the source of illumination.
Yeah, it illuminates everything else.
Yeah. So, I mean, do we need a value or an ideal or a principle that is like that? And I will just throw in there as well. There is a fascinating 20th century philosopher and Christian apologist, René Girard, who associates God with the repudiation of the scapegoating, the scapegoat principle. And Satan or the devil is associated with scapegoating. So in this sense, the highest value of Christianity would be the repudiation of scapegoating. And that's what redemption or salvation, specifically, that's what Christ's atonement does. He's the final sacrifice. He is the scapegoat who undoes scapegoating. Therefore, we don't need to scapegoat anymore. So that, you could say, a Christian could say that's the highest value of Christianity. And, that is an interesting guiding value, the undoing of scapegoating. But yes, do we need a kind of value or a set of values? And how multiplicious can those values be which guide society? I think a fear of a lot of monotheistic and monotheistically inclined people is this too much diversity of values as just a recipe for chaos.
I think we do need values or principles to replace a belief in God. I don't think it has to be one value or principle.
Well, how hierarchical and structured do you think they ought to be?
They being what exactly?
Society's guiding principles. It's bedrock principles, or it's.
Well, that's difficult to answer in the abstract, I think. I don't know that it has to be hierarchical. I think it should be fairly normative. So in that sense, I think, it depends if we're talking about the impact of the state as such. I mean, that's probably a bit outside what we want to talk about here, but I don't necessarily mean hierarchical in a sense of what the state does. I think that we should, we as a society, so as citizens, as friends, as parents, family members, and so forth, as consumers as well, we should seek to promote certain norms quite strongly, though I don't necessarily mean by literal use of force. Sometimes that's necessary. And what norms should we be promoting? Well, I mean, anything that I say is not going to be especially novel there. We should promote norms of compassion, curiosity, inclusion, epistemic humility, open-mindedness, academic rigor in many contexts. I think society could do a bit more of that. And pro-social norms, all sorts of the sort of good stuff like that.
Rationality is up there.
And rationality will be one of those, yes. So these are the sorts of norms and principles that I think we should promote as a society. I think that they should be promoted quite sort of extensively in many contexts, and much more than I think they are. But I don't know that has to come in a hierarchical way. I think that ideally that comes in a very, maybe some degree of hierarchy, but also in a bottom-up way as well, in a holistic way, I guess, throughout society, that society should be suffused with our attempts to do better at adhering to these norms. I don't think we need to have a single framework for drawing all of those together like traditional religions try to provide. I don't think there is any such thing. Speaking from a sort of metaphysical naturalist point of view, but I also don't think such a thing is necessary. I think different people can sort of tell different stories, develop different narratives for their own lives or sub-communities that they engage in, subject to certain constraints, obviously, of rationality and other things. Not every story is going to sort of work or be as defensible, but there are many ways to make sense of your life and how you relate to the world. And I think that we can embrace a diversity of those as long as they're sort of broadly consistent with sort of some of the basic principles that I mentioned.
Well, one of the reasons that love and rationality would be contrasted, especially in our Western philosophical tradition, is because of the Kantian ideas of of the ethical as being about duty.
Yeah.
And there's clearly an interesting relationship between love and the ethical, because it's far easier to be ethical toward people and things which you have some love for, some care for, than things which you don't. And so it seems instrumentally rational that if you could expand that sense of an inclusive consciousness or a loving consciousness to include more things, that would be less burdensome and therefore more rational a way of engaging with the world on an ethical basis than forcing yourself to go through with all of your duties. I mean, reducing the extent to which your ethical commitments are burdensome is itself an ethical priority. And I believe that has to do with the manner in which you relate to those values. I think that there's a relational dimension to values in a way that is more than metaphorical to how we relate to other people. If you reflect on what's value about what you're doing, if you make it, let's say you make a presentation, but you beautify it, so you try and really draw people's attention to it. If you get into a nice mood, if you try and work smart rather than working hard, you're taking a loving attitude to your work, you can get farther with it, which can make ethical commitments less burdensome. And so I do think that is a clear connection between the two.
Between love and rationality.
Yes, yeah. Specifically, love being in service of rationality. And I think, again, this idea of an inclusive consciousness and openness, people tend to take these psychological traits for granted, but I'm speaking partly from experience here. Someone who's, when I've had severe depression, there's just a closing off in terms of my curiosity and compassion toward both people and things, even things which are valuable to me. Suddenly their value becomes abstract. It's like I can't relate to it anymore on a personal level. It's very strange. But I don't think this is reducible to health. A huge problem with our society is we tend to view ethics and rationality both in terms of health rather than as relational dynamics to do with other values such as inclusivity, compassion, empathy, etc. Anyway, put that all to a side. Can of worms. Let's ask about the value of faith itself. And I maybe want to come back to dogma as well. What is the value of faith and self-fulfilling beliefs beyond the realms of superstition, wishful thinking, and delusion? So consider Walter Kaufmann's definition, philosopher Walter Kaufmann's definition. Faith means intense, usually confident belief that is not based on evidence sufficient to command assent from every reasonable person. So in some sense, Kaufmann here is evoking the reasonable person standard, which we know from the legal tradition, which is a fictional person on the tram, what this average person would think is reasonable. Faith-based beliefs are those which are intense, usually confident, but not based on evidence sufficient to command assent, that is, to persuade every reasonable person. What is the value of such beliefs beyond delusion, wishful thinking, and superstition?
Yeah, well, assuming that we understand the idea of the evidence not being sufficient to command consent from every reasonable person, assuming that means every reasonable person who was able to understand that relevant evidence.
Yes.
But I imagine that's the implication there.
Yes.
I think that's a pretty good definition, actually. I haven't seen that one before. I'm tempted to say that faith, thus defined, has little to no value. I'm imagining you're going to push back on that.
I'm astonished that you'd say that.
Well, because, let me just... you
must have had some faith to come on this podcast, for instance.
Well, yeah, but depending on...
Could have been a shit show.
I suppose that depends on what you think my evidence was, but... I think, again, it is going to depend a bit on how we unpack that every reasonable person. Maybe every is very broad, and so you might say, well, there's some reasonable person who wouldn't have assented based on that evidence. But I guess broadly, I'm pretty strong. I lean pretty strongly in the evidentialist viewpoint, which is to say that your belief should be shaped pretty directly and in line with and constrained by the evidence that you have, and not go beyond that. And so I agree that we do need to have a trust in things that we do not have absolute knowledge about, and sometimes we may only have very limited knowledge about them. In those contexts, I would say that our trust or faith, if you want to use that term, should be just proportional to the evidence that we have. And so this quote here saying that faith is intense, confident belief that is not based on sufficient evidence.
For every reasonable person.
Yeah, well, who is aware of that evidence? So, I mean, I guess it depends a bit on how much...
That's every political worldview to begin with.
So what do you mean?
Every political worldview is based on intense, confident belief that is not based on evidence sufficient to persuade every reasonable person. Otherwise, every reasonable person would have the same political commitments.
Well, every reasonable person is not in practice party to all of the relevant evidence.
Right.
So you might think that your beliefs, you might strongly hold to your beliefs, which are not shared by other people.
But there are practical time constraints as well here in terms of...
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
But the
so
point
what's
is,
the value of this evidentiary bias given these real-world time constraints? Pardon me, don't those time constraints increase the value of faith somewhat?
I don't see how.
Well, you don't always have the relevant time to assess. You don't always have the time to assess the relevant evidence.
Yeah, that's right. So we don't have time to assess the relevant evidence. So how do we act in situations where we have limited evidence and limited time to process that evidence and or gain more evidence? I would say that warrants humility, not greater confidence. So I don't understand how you go from we lack evidence, lack the time to think about it, lack the time to gather more evidence, to therefore we should increase our confidence beyond what can be justified by the evidence available. That's what I don't really understand. It seems to me that you're pretty much... I don't want to say there's never any possible circumstances where you can imagine that might be valuable for some purpose, but in general, I don't think that that's a good thing to do. I think we should, when we have limited evidence, we should be aware of this. I mean, isn't this the whole idea of wisdom, right? To be aware of what you don't know, the limits of your knowledge. Why would we then want to hold a confidence greater than is justified by our evidence at a given point in time?
Yeah, so ordinarily, I try and be rational rather than optimistic or pessimistic. And ordinarily, I try and be virtuous rather than positive or negative. So I share an evidentiary bias to an extent, but I do think that, well, the second part of that question was the value of faith and also self-fulfilling beliefs. And the self-fulfilling and self-defeating beliefs that's a far trickier area to think about. What I like to say, one of the easiest ways, a term for both self-fulfilling and self-negating beliefs, by the way, is autogenesis. Auto from the scientific part, from terms like automaticity, genesis having the mythic connotations, obviously from its biblical heritage. Self-fulfilling beliefs, autogenesis. One of the clearest ways of seeing that in practice is if you wake up and you're feeling fatigued or you're feeling overly tired or whatever, you can hear the autogenetic beliefs bubbling up from the unconscious saying, oh, it's important, you should get out of bed, or you could probably sleep in, maybe it's good for you. Oh, but then that'll set a bad precedent. Yeah. You could almost hear these self-fulfilling beliefs suggesting themselves to you coming up from the unconscious. And self-fulfilling beliefs are not intrinsically rational or irrational. In fact, they span a huge range.
Yeah.
And this gets into the whole psychological area of conditioning as well. And what is called in the scientific literature belief effects associated with placebos and other things like that. That's distinct from faith, but it's related to faith because there is a certain element of faith involved in some of these self-fulfilling and self-negating beliefs. So your initial answer was you believed there is relatively little value in both faith and self-fulfilling beliefs beyond the realm of superstition, wishful thinking, and delusion. You don't think in your life that there are faith-based commitments or self-fulfilling beliefs that have an instrumental rationality or usefulness outside of the religious domain?
I think I'd be more inclined to describe things that I think you have in mind as perhaps hope. Because I wouldn't say, let me take an example, because I mean, there are a lot of things that I do in life, look at my podcast, trying to get into academia, writing a book and hoping that people read it, things like this, right? Where I don't know what impact I will have or whether I will achieve what I want to, but I still strive anyway and act as if, in some ways I act as if I have a stronger confidence than I do. But I don't know that you have to actually cast that out in terms of, oh, I actually have a belief of this credence that's stronger than I can justify with evidence. I think we can justify a certain level of belief. And beyond that, I would say, well, I hope it will work out well, and I'm just going to try my best. I don't know that you need to then take it to the level of saying, oh, I strongly believe that it will. To me, that's where delusion is coming in. And I don't think that's helpful in most cases.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? Because hope can have a danger of its own.
Oh, that's true. Yes, absolutely.
And sometimes the self-fulfilling belief, I mean, trivial example of this is something like weightlifting or sports, right? When you're pushed beyond your physical limits, you just kind of adopt this attitude like, I will do this, I can. And that's a good way of like kind of just cognitively countering the pain of the difficulty of going through the experience.
Yeah, I don't see any contradiction there because if it is something that you can do, but it requires a positive attitude, then there's nothing inconsistent with believing that, adopting this positive attitude will help me to succeed. And then it's reasonable to believe that I will succeed conditional on having this attitude, right? But there's a difference there between telling yourself, I will win, or, I will achieve this very high level, which even in spite of the fact that it's objectively probably not very likely that you will. I think that sort of thinking can lead to a lot of disappointment. It can lead to people doing things that are unhealthy for them or for their relationships. It can lead to entitlement. Not to say that it always does, but I think it has negative consequences for what I would say is taking it too far. And that can happen with hope as well. I don't disagree with that.
So I agree with you. We as much as possible, we ought to have a rational evidentiary foundation for our hopes, self-fulfilling beliefs, and faith according to Kaufman's definition. The troublesome thing to me is what precisely is a rational foundation for these things. It's complicated, and I think that
I think everyone needs to work that out for themselves in their own life, to be honest, because it's very contingent on one's situation, skills, abilities, and I think that's a big part of wisdom, of determining what your capabilities are, a realistic appraisal of your capabilities and your limits, and then striving your best, in spite of maybe the limitations that you're aware of, without leading you to despair. I don't say that that's easy. I personally don't think that faith in the way that we're characterizing it here is particularly helpful in that context. Perhaps it's the best some people have who don't have the ability to sort of have a rational appraisal of their limitations or their capabilities and need that as a support. And so I'm open to the fact that perhaps given particular people's psychological circumstances or other circumstances, that may be what they need. But I would say that could be true for a very wide range of beliefs, that they might be very useful for those people in those circumstances. But in the broader sense, I would say they're still not really justified. Yeah, they might be the best someone can do in a given circumstance.
It gets into the whole debates between pragmatism and realism.
Yeah, absolutely. I acknowledge that.
Intricate stuff. Running parallel to the God question is the Antitheism Question. It is whether we as individuals or we as a species would be better off living in a God-governed universe or a godless one. Voltaire famously wrote that if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. Bakunin considered the idea of God as a serious threat to human liberty, claiming that, quote, as long as we have a master in heaven, we will continue to be slaves on earth. He therefore reversed Voltaire's famous aphorism, claiming that if God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. Is this a worthy line of inquiry or debate, even if we assume, for argument's sake, that atheism is true? This question of whether we'd be better off in a God-governed or godless universe?
I don't know that there's a whole lot to gain by thinking about that. I mean, it is relevant to certain questions, especially relating to the problem of evil. Why is there so much evil and suffering in the world if it's governed by an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent God? I personally think that that's a very profound problem for theism. And if you really believed that, then it's hard not to, if you really believe that the universe was so governed, it's hard not to think that would just be better, almost by definition, but even just sort of intuitively and from a logical point of view about the sort of outcome that we would expect to achieve if there was such a capable and benevolent being who was governing everything. So in that sense, it seems like it would be a better place. That being said, I also think that the particular vision of the cosmos that has been developed and defended by, well, at least certain monotheistic religious traditions, I find I find very unattractive. The idea of an eternal hell where people are tormented, for example, for disobeying God, and where God seemingly requires us to engage in total submission to his demands and things like that. I find that all very unattractive. So in that sense, maybe we are better off without a God. But I mean, it's very difficult in these debates because people will then say, well, whatever God wants or commands us is by definition good. And so we might not like it, but it still is better for us in that cosmic framework, right? So it's, I think, rather difficult to adjudicate those sorts of claims. But at the same level, I think that we should be interested in the way reality is and not how we might hope it to be. With the caveat that we should strive to improve it, right? But for issues where we have no control, such as whether God exists, well, it is what it is.
Yeah, so a general problem with the use of evidence and logic as opposed to the use of reasonable speculation, imagination, rationality more broadly defined is this question of time constraints. We live in a time of unprecedented change. And so this question, the AQ, the antitheism question, becomes interesting when we think about artificial general intelligence. Is Godhood or God making a useful analogy for artificial general intelligence? And if so, is Godhood, making a God, something to be pursued or something to be avoided? Do we want to become gods? Do we want to create a God? Is there a risk of creating a God?
People do use this language quite a lot, especially in the context of new technology, about playing God with so-and-so, by which they seem to simply mean exercising control over something. And I think that that's interesting that a lot of people seem to associate control, particularly over things that seem like we traditionally have not had control over, perhaps the weather or biology or, I don't know, travel, very fast travel, or all sorts of other things that people might think of as things that humans were not supposed to know or not supposed to be able to do. Now, I guess I don't really share that sort of sense of there being any intrinsic boundary to what it is and is not appropriate for humans to do. I think it's really a question about what we can do and then what the consequences of exercising certain capabilities would be. So in that sense, should we strive to become God? I think there's a sense in which we should, maybe not literally, but in the sense of striving to achieve greater mastery over our environment and mastery over our own destiny, which presumably God has. I think we should strive to do that, not in a purely self-interested point of view, but more in terms of the human species. We should be trying to better the world. We should have a sense of
that's striving for
agency.
Autonomy and agency.
Well, but that's an important aspect of the nature of God, is that he is an agent who has ultimate not autonomy and authority. Now, maybe we shouldn't be striving for to subject all of nature, to our mastery, and arguably the way that God does. But so I suppose it depends on exactly what you think it would mean for us to strive to be gods. But in some senses, I think that we can say we should do that, striving for more autonomy and ability to overcome difficulties in our path.
So you think that there is some utility of the metaphor of God or of the ideas of God as an analogy for AGI or for a transhuman or post-human potential subject, at least as God and gods have been defined in the past as being, without limitations or having greater knowledge or greater compassion, etc.
There's a place for that sort of language. I mean, I would be quite reticent to use it myself, depends on the context. But, there's certain aphorisms that lend themselves to this sort of thought. Like, I think, was it Arthur C. Clarke who said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic? And I guess I would add to that, indistinguishable from a divine miracle as well. And there's ways we can think about technology where, in some sense, we are, like, if you think about human capabilities and powers as being extended, so not just purely limited to our body, but extended to the devices and social institutions we can call upon to find answers to things or achieve things, then we have dramatically expanded human powers over the past centuries and millennia, and become near demigods by contrast to what people were, 5,000 years ago, and what they would have understood if we were to go back and interact with them. And so I think that thinking about that in a mythological context or a science fiction context can help us to conceptualize both and really understand how far we've come and how far there is still to go. I've actually pointed this out in religious contexts as well, where people make arguments about miracles or prophecies and things like this. And I sort of point out that Well, look, maybe God is intervening in the course of human affairs, and maybe this tells us something, but how can you rule out the idea that there aren't very capable beings, like aliens or something, or artificial intelligences created by who knows what that have traveled to our planet, that aren't intervening in the course of human affairs for whatever purposes, right? Now, I don't want to say that I believe that that's happening, but the point is, how would we distinguish those two cases? How do you distinguish between a very technologically sophisticated civilization or entity and an actual sort of God or supernatural being or entity? I think that it's in many cases incredibly difficult, and those begin to look very similar to each other. So I think that there is some use here in certain cases of that sort of language, but I want to be careful about what people aren't getting misconceptions about that, because I think that could go too far.
There are clearly dangers as well, of course.
Well, any new technology has dangers.
No, but I mean the danger specifically of the metaphor.
Yes,
the metaphor.
yes.
Define AGI as a god or the devil or the Antichrist. You get into very fishy waters. So I have my own answer to this question, hypothetical, that I asked at the moment. What is the value of asking the God question as compared with other existentially or psychologically relevant questions? You said it wouldn't even be in your top 10 most urgent, fruitful questions, which is quite interesting given the amount of time you've devoted to it. Perhaps, just as a brief aside, perhaps you've devoted that time to it precisely so as to encourage people to move on to more productive questions.
That's partly true. I should emphasize that when I mention that prioritization, I would say that's for humanity as a whole in some broad sense. Now, that doesn't necessarily, that my own personal priorities can look very different to that, because I have my own interests and proclivities and talents and comparative advantage and so forth. So I think that one's own personal priority should be informed by, let's say, global priorities, but they don't always have to look exactly the same. But anyway, part of it is, I think, to help people move on from the question, because I think many people are, well, to put it bluntly, wedded to, in my view, outdated theological and metaphysical beliefs that can be dispensed with. Now, I don't say all religion is in that category. I mean, I'm an atheist, so I think in some sense all theologically or metaphysically realist versions of God of views about God are false. But I don't think that they're all in that same sort of problematic, outdated bucket that I would put some views in. But, examples would be dualistic views about the soul and the mind, for example, or any views that imply a sort of a traditional subordinate role for women and reproductive rights, and we can go on about these sorts of things. So I think there are a whole basket of views, social political views and theological views that underpin them, which can and should be dispensed with or replaced with other beliefs. And it's one of the reasons I am interested in the God question, and I think it is important, is because there are a lot of people, including influential people in the West and elsewhere in the world, who hold to these beliefs, and I think that we need to push back against them. And there are a disturbing number, without getting into a lot of detail here, there are a disturbing number of political and social positions about conflicts in the world and about social priorities and government priorities and all sorts of other things that are informed by, in my view, very outdated and poorly supported metaphysical and theological positions. And so in that sense, I push back against those in the hope that I can make a small difference in getting people to move on from those. Now, whether that's to an atheistic position or more thoughtful, nuanced, progressive religious positions, I don't have as strong a view about that. Obviously, I have a bias towards people adopting my worldview because I think it's the most correct one. Otherwise, I would hold a different one. But obviously, I also value plurality, and I don't think I've got everything right. So, yeah, partly to answer the question, my interest in the God question is in part because I want to encourage certain types of people to move on from the God question. I don't want to say that's my only motivation. I think that it does have interesting things to say or interesting connections to many of the important questions in life, like morality, like creation and origins, like the place of humanity in the cosmos and the meaning of life and things like that. So I'm interested in those questions as well. So there's a combination of reasons as to why I personally pursue it, despite I wouldn't put it in the top 10 of most pressing questions for humanity.
So I was thinking, and this will be my final question, by way of analogy to Voltaire and Bakunin's debate, would it be worth asking the soul question, namely, if the soul does not exist, should we invent it? I'm using the terms soul here in a way similar to how it was defined by the psychologist James Hillman, as a distinctive, innate, irreplaceable perspective which human beings develop over their lifetime, somewhat analogous to genomic potential, which irrespective of their differences in character, although it's related to them, makes them uniquely valuable both as individuals and as a collective when compared with other forms of life. That was my brief definition. And James Hillman, the psychologist, had another definition. He said it's a perspective rather than a substance, a viewpoint toward things rather than a thing itself. So we have a lot of discussions about uploading consciousness and all that kind of thing, and not a lot about asking ourselves which aspects of consciousness are those which are, and specifically which aspects of the legacies of people and the memories we have of people are most worth either preserving, culturally preserving, or digitally preserving, like uploading to the cloud type of thing. And we discussed briefly this idea of the value of human beings based on our ignorance of their potential value. I wonder if it might be worth us engaging in what James Hillman calls soul making, but I'm also adapting to mean something technical, which would be a kind of encryption of the person's lifespan potential, such that there's a basis for the universal consideration of interests other than our shared genomic inheritance. Because if through data science we have greater interest of people's lifespan potential, that could become a basis for a very dangerous type of inegalitarianism. Likewise, if we have class-based speciation based on breakthroughs in medical science driven by AI, people's financial differences translate into biological, there's speciation along class lines. This could effectively overturn our shared genetic inheritance as a basis for the universal consideration of equal rights. And so creating something like a soul that is somehow a more concrete basis for the universal recognition of our shared humanity, number one, and an equal consideration of people's interests. Is the soul metaphor something worth considering as a project?
Yeah, well, that is an interesting question. In terms of how you've defined it using the language of Hillman, I think I would be inclined to refer to that as a self or something similar. I know that I think I understand some of the reasons for using a perhaps stronger and more resonating term like soul. I personally am, let me take a step back from that. So I think where we at least are going to be in agreement is that the traditional, at least Western conception of soul as having some sort of immaterial substance that transcends the body and that survives death and is probably made by God and a bunch of other things is not a sustainable, well, I shouldn't say sustainable, that is not a defensible viewpoint in today's day and age. I mean, there are some people who try to defend it, but I don't think it's very wise to do so. So I think that should be rejected. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to reject the notion of souls or the term completely. So the question then is, do we think that we should pursue some kind of reformist conception of souls and preserve it in a maybe modified form, or do we think that it's something that we should just discard as being too problematic?
And the question is it the baby in the bathwater that people are afraid of throwing out with religion?
Yes, essentially that's what it amounts to. I am open to this notion of a reforming conception because I think that that's actually a lot of what we need to do in philosophy. We start with a hodgepodge of folk intuitions and misconceptions, and we need to try to rationalize those, unify them into a logical framework which is consistent with science. And a lot of the times there has to be changes made that alter things from how we sort of naively or intuitively understand them. I mean, we see this a lot from the history of physics and other sciences as well as philosophy. My concern there is that there are limits to how far one can go before the concept is so divorced from its sort of pre-theoretic or traditional conceptions that it just isn't tenable to maintain the same terminology anymore. And I worry that that's the case for the soul. Now, this is largely an empirical question about what you can sort of get away with in terms of soul talk and bring people along with you. Mm-hmm. I am very uncomfortable with soul talk, even in a reformed sense, just because I don't know how well those sort of reformist conceptions are being communicated to people. I still think that in a Western context, it carries too much of those sort of pre-scientific folk intuitions of substance dualism or of transcendence or of some component that's our true essence, that's essentializing. I think that's one issue, but also that is sort of independent from any physical substrate. I think that there are a lot of problems inherent in those beliefs, and I don't want to say it's impossible to have a reformist conception of the soul that avoids those, but I'm rather skeptical, and I don't know if we can get there. And I lean towards thinking that it might be better to just use a different term for what we want to do. But I don't know. I'm ultimately
it's interesting. You came back to dualisms, and we do live in a time of new dualisms. There is the bio self, for instance, and the data self. The person you are, the image you can construct for yourself, and which is constructed of others, which is more than a public persona, but it is now also things like digital profiles with governments and corporations, different credit scores, all that kind of thing. And then there is also, of course, the person you were in life and in death. Ours is a unique time in which the legacy which you leave behind it's far easier to create and preserve this legacy digitally. And so the question of which aspect of the person's life and or consciousness is worth ennobling, concentrating on, preserving is an interesting one.
Well, yeah, and that's a very worthy question. I guess one of the issues there is what language do we use to talk about that?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So Hillman tried to re-envision psychology as soul-making. And he had this idea that my definition of soul-making, summarizing his definition, is that it's a self-generative, imaginative process by which the individual is ennobled with a mythopoetic account of themselves, specifically the soul providing an account for itself. So it's self-generative and self-referential, whose relational dimension re-envisions and thereby recovers the world as a place of soul. So there's this all-encompassing definition. It is kind of more of an animistic idea of soul than a monotheistic, animistic or polytheistic. In any case, so yes, there's a terminology and specifics. There's a lot to discuss there. But I think from an existential point of view, the cumulative threats which are posed by emerging technologies, specifically artificial and general intelligence, and the two dual threats that I'm concerned by, you know what? No, I'll put aside the two, just the one threat of class-based speciation, the translation of existing structural advantages like market power, physical and digital capital, into effectively irreversible genetic advantages bought through earlier access to high-cost augmentation, resulting in speciation, where the resultant social classes avoid or become incapable of interbreeding. That might sound like a wild science fiction idea, but I do think it is within the realm of possibility and has a historical precedent in things like racialism as an ideology.
Yes,
I think the real world threats we're facing as a consequence of the exponential rate of technological change means that the soul question or soul questions, or perhaps more generally psychological questions, should take precedence over the question of God's existence and related theological concerns. That is my tentative conclusion at this stage. That's how I feel.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say a word on that, which is, I'm not entirely comfortable with the soul language as we've just discussed, but in terms of the broader project of trying to identify what it is about, I guess, humans that makes us unique, makes us valuable, that we think we should focus on preserving and valuing through technological and social means. I think that that's an extremely important project. I mean, it's not directly, but it's indirectly one of the things I work on in my research, which is I study language in particular and how humans think and reason. And I think that's a very important part of human existence. And so I'm very interested in these sorts of questions from a sort of scientific point of view as well as a philosophical point of view. I would also say that the God question is connected here in part because many people, well, in discussing these sorts of issues, whether it's in the language of souls or selves or something else, one is inevitably going to encounter religious perspectives, including traditional religious perspectives that are quite deeply entrenched. and people will defend, or at least some people will defend quite vigorously. And I think that it is one of the things we will have to do as a society, some societies more than others perhaps, is to continue to critically evaluate and I would say argue against these, at least many of these traditional religious perspectives, in order to then progress the discussion to those issues that you've highlighted. I think it's difficult to really move forward as a society, as a species, even when we still have to deal with, put it bluntly, people who think that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago. That's just one specific example, but there's a cluster of a bunch of beliefs, not just that one, but a lot of things relating to that, which are grounded in certain religious conceptions, which make it quite difficult, I think, to move the conversation onto where it needs to be. And so I think that you still, if you want to think of pursuing the sort of soul question as you describe it, as where we're needing to advance towards, we also need to fight, if you like, a rearguard action against those who are sort of left behind with these, I would say, sort of outdated conceptions and are trying to impede us in various ways from discussing these issues.
It is politically complicated, though, because
yes, of course.
There's also, I mean, there was an alliance between fascism and traditional forms of Christianity in the early 20th century. There has since become a rift between the two. And it's fair to say the Catholic Church is very progressive today compared to where it was 100 years ago, especially if you look at the Christian church's political wings in Western Europe, like the Christian Democratic Party in Germany and Austria are quite progressive. So, I mean...
Yes, well, I'm not talking about them, but yeah, I mean, it's a strange world when... No, go ahead.
Well, but I mean, American Christianity does, and the Anglo-Saxon world tends to skew our view of Christianity, I think, a bit.
Oh, absolutely true. But what I was going to say is it's a strange world where many American conservatives apparently look to strongmen in Russia for, I guess, moral guidance, or perhaps a view of what the state should look like more so than they do to the Vatican. That is quite an interesting development. I mean, obviously there's been anti-Catholic prejudice in the US as well. But I mean, the point is that recent political developments have upended a lot of traditional political affiliations and associations. And I agree with you. I'm not intending to cast an overly wide net in my description about sort of outdated traditional religious beliefs. And I recognize that they're only a minority within Christianity, and they are perhaps more focused in the Anglosphere. But one of the issues is, because of the position of America in particular as a political and economic and cultural leader, they have very outsized impacts. And so I think that it is important because developments in America have so much of an effect elsewhere, that when conservative political and religious ideologies form a strange unholy alliance in the US and gain social and political power because of that, that has flow-on effects everywhere else. And so I do think that it's not enough to address those on socio-political terms, but also we need to address some of the theological and philosophical beliefs that underpin the beliefs of at least many of these people who support these policies.
Yes, the American influence thing has been true, but interestingly, in terms of religion, in terms of Christianity, it's increasingly, I mean, American Catholics don't have some hegemonic power over the Catholic Church, for instance.
Yeah.
Protestantism has always been a fractious collection of... Anyway,
yes.
My view of things, very briefly, is that if we, the people, philosophers or otherwise, don't contend with the threats of emerging technologies, AI, transhumanism, etc., the fear that could generate could push moderate, religious, conservative-oriented people into a fascistic direction as a kind of alternative, with AGI and technology in general becoming increasingly demonized. And so trying to solve the problems posed by technology, I think, is a more urgent problem than dealing with the legacy problems of superstition and authoritarianism inherited by religion, because I think if we don't solve the new and emerging problems, the old ones will get worse.
Well, I think it'll be harder to solve. It's harder to solve these new problems precisely because of these old problems that haven't gone away. So I see them as bound together. But of course, we need to press. I think we need efforts on both of them.
Yes,
not just the one.
They are bound together in a surprising way. Well, I think, shall we wrap it there?
Yeah, I think that's a good place as any to end it.
All right. So you can find James on his personal website, jamesphoto.com, which includes a link of a variety of his different works, including his YouTube channel, which you can just find under the name James Fodor, the podcast, available at thescienceofeverything.net or wherever you get your podcasts. And I just want to say I've had more caffeine than usual today, in part to prepare for this conversation, because I think if you and Ben Shapiro ever got into any kind of public conversation or debate with each other, it might create a world record for the highest words per minute exchanged in a singular conversation. So I was half afraid to be stumped and half afraid just to be left behind, but I'm glad that I think I've kept pace.
Oh, it was good. It was good. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Awesome. All right, James. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks.
Have a nice evening. Thank you for listening to the podcast. In this episode's overtime segment, I wanted to do something a little bit different. Listening through this podcast while I was editing it, I realized that I was struggling a bit between playing the host and myself being a participant in the discussion, to the point where my guest, James Fodor, raised a series of interesting objections to my points, which could have become the basis for a more interesting discussion, but several times in the interest of time and keeping things on track, I didn't fully engage with them. And so I just felt it might be interesting to go back and respond to some of those points that he raised in objection to some of the distinctions which I proposed. Beginning with my proposed distinction between the domains of relatively calculable and relatively incalculable value, as an attempt at secularizing or making sense of a distinction between the sacred and mundane, or of attempting to specify what divine worth means or should mean. I should first make clear my distinction here from traditional religious conceptions of the absolute or the divine. It would be my contention that religious thinking characteristically conflates values which are inestimable with infinite values. That's what I take to mean by a term like absolute, be that absolute value or ultimate reality or absolute morality or any other absolutist distinction. But I think it's important to be able to talk about things of great value, questions of magnitude, scale, gravity, etc., without being disproportionate in our use of language. So we know from both algebra and from the legal tradition that it's possible to compare and even do mathematics with values which are either in principle unknown or just unknown for a certain period of time, but it's still possible to speak about them in comparative and evaluative terms in a meaningful way. James objected to my distinction between calculable and incalculable values by saying it seemed too relativistic to him, given that what is calculable or knowable more generally is a constantly moving target. He said, quote, "I don't know if there are very principled, specific limits to what our knowledge could be." There are several ways I could reply to this. The first thing I think would be worth discussing is the value of my distinction more generally. If you think in terms of economics, insurance, or criminal justice, there is a common sense meaning to terms like immeasurable or incalculable worth, or both in common sense parlance and in specific contexts like a legal or journalistic context. Such terms are often used to specify both great harms and things of great value, especially when great harm is done to things of great value. So from a moral and legal standpoint, I think it's reasonable to argue that serious harms done to a person, for instance, killing or some other severe violation, does relatively incalculable harm as compared with the harm done to the property, because there's an asymmetry between the potential uses which a person could put their life toward and the potential uses which, for instance, a chair or a car or some other piece of property could be put toward. So if you wanted to insure an item or award criminal damages for the destruction of some property, you would be able to compensate a person relatively fairly and accurately, as opposed to trying to compensate harms done to a person or something else whose value is somewhat more intangible, perhaps like a work of art. So in spite of the fact that what is measurable, calculable, or knowable has been evolving, some of these fundamental distinctions, such as between living entities and between objects, between an object which is merely of instrumental value, and such as an oven or a toaster, and objects which have sentimental or cultural value. These distinctions have been very long-standing, and they are aligned, typically, with values that are at the very least difficult to measure or calculate. Not necessarily incalculable, but relatively calculable as compared with objects or other entities whose potential uses are more restricted or more limited. And it's my view that this common sense use of language, talking of things as immeasurable, priceless, incalculable, etc., is more than hyperbole. I think it reveals an important insight. That is that we ought to be more concerned about decisions regarding those entities of relatively incalculable worth, like people or other forms of life, including those things which sustain life, like clean air or an ecosystem, because decisions regarding those entities of relatively incalculable worth entail more unknown risks. Thinking here is that there is only so much harm that can be done with the destruction of an empty building, as compared with all of the unknown harms that could be done through the destruction of a building with people in it. It isn't just that we know that people are more valuable than objects, it's the value which is unknown is also relevant because it means that we have to have a certain degree of hesitancy in our decision-making. This basic distinction between incalculable and calculable values could help us focus on the principles which ought to guide us when making decisions in conditions of uncertainty, and on how to be guided by values like humility and avoiding dangers such as hubris or arrogance. Secondly, with respect to the practical psychological dimension of this distinction, I think that simply the act of making a distinction between relatively calculable and incalculable values can be used as an educational tool for teaching people better relating, specifically with respect to the relationship of our decision-making, or of our means-ends analysis, our rationality, with time, and most particularly with our sense of urgency. It's my strong view that, and this is part of what informs my perspective on this, it's my strong view that nothing deranges our decision-making more reliably than either an excessive or deficient sense of urgency. If you think the two extremes ends of this sense, you have emotions like panic or lethargy. You're either so rushed that you don't take the proper time to assess things, or you're so lackadaisical you let the opportunity pass, and so on. I think that there's a parallel here between our ethical understanding and our scientific understanding, which is that our intuitions, with respect to understanding the natural world, our intuitions in the sciences break down on the microcosmic and the macrocosmic scales, the very small and the very large. That is, at the quantum level and on the level of cosmology. Those tend to be where our scientific instruments, our available mathematics and theories are pushed to their limits. And if you look at the history of science, it clearly shows a progression from us understanding those objects and phenomena which are perceptible more to the naked eye and with relatively simple instruments, typically on the local scale, to us understanding things at a finer grain of detail through telescopes, microscopes, etc. Both things which are very close to us but we can't see with the naked eye, things which are very far away and we can't see with the naked eye. I think so too in ethics. It is not the very small and the very large, but the very sudden or quick and the very gradual or slow which we struggle to understand ethically. For instance, we struggle to understand the moral significance of what we're doing right now in this next minute as compared with the moral significance of what we're planning on doing over weeks and months. It's far easier to set an ethical intention and then follow through with your intentions over days and weeks than it is to know exactly what to do in the moment, especially when faced with a compressed time window. Say you're driving a car and then something or someone runs onto the road and you have to make a split-minute decision. Practical time constraints stress our ethical intuitions, both because we have less available cognition and other resources to assess the issue itself, and because we're deranged by things like stress and other circumstantial or environmental pressures. And then if we think about the ethical impacts of our actions on subsequent generations, whether as individuals or as a whole civilization, that can also be quite difficult to assess. Then if you attempt to incorporate the likely consequence of your actions on coming generations into your social and political behavior on the day-to-day, people tend to find that very difficult. And so this distinction between relatively calculable and incalculable values is a way of rehearsing and reminding ourselves of what we know and what we don't know, and what we might come to know, etc. It's a way of grounding our decision-making with a sense of humility and patience and associated values. James's objection when he said that he doesn't know if there are, quote, very principled, specific limits to what our knowledge could be. There are various parts of that sentence that are worth engaging with, but I'll start with the could part, our knowledge could be, and say that, firstly, this is a part of my concern. There's a question of what the limits of our knowledge could be, and then what the limits of our knowledge should be or ought to be in an ethical sense. And it would be my argument here that we are increasingly required to either construct or observe limits to our new technical powers, that is to say, ethical, legal, political limits, because those powers are no longer limited by the existing level of technology or the laws of physics. So, for instance, it's far easier for society to respect people's personal rights if weapons and surveillance technologies are relatively primitive. Something like the Second Amendment in the United States was originally a much more practical regulation when they were dealing with more primitive levels of firearms. And the manner in which emerging technologies are increasingly outpacing regulation is predictably causing crises in our time, especially where technological innovation is combined with relatively stagnant or corrupt political systems, as in the United States. Likewise, with surveillance technologies, it was never necessary to pass regulations or to stage protests to prevent corporations from installing cameras in people's bedrooms, because the cost of the corporations doing so and the incentive structure would have just been so ridiculous and prohibitive that they would have never have thought to do it. But if you can install microphones and cameras in people's smartphones and you can provide access to the state, as companies like Apple presently do, in exchange for privileged access to government services, certain companies will take advantage of legal grey areas and seize the opportunity. And so this ties in with the idea of what the limits to our knowledge should be. There's a certain knowledge or peace of mind we can acquire by having greater surveillance apparatuses established. So for much of the 20th century, if your kids or your spouse or your family members were out hitchhiking or doing whatever, they wouldn't have a mobile phone on them. You couldn't track them. They'd be exposed to all kinds of dangers. So part of this placing limits on our knowledge thing has to do with the trade-off between values such as privacy and security. Specifically us asking which risks are more worth taking, which values are more worth sacrificing in a particular instance as compared with another value. So this epistemological dimension to the balancing of rights has a lot to do with, as I said, observing or constructing limits to our knowledge which didn't previously exist. But then switching to the specific limits to what our knowledge could be, that is a harder objection to my distinction. Two simple answers I would make to that. The first is to observe how we have had long-standing intuitions of certain entities being of relatively incalculable value as compared with others, owing to their greater potential range of uses, such as people, animals, other objects of sentimental or cultural value, as compared with non-living entities and objects of merely instrumental value. These fundamental ethical distinctions have remained over millennia in spite of our developments in science and other understanding, the development of algebra, rationality, and logic, and so forth. And secondly, a deeper and more general limit to what our knowledge could be. And this, I think, is arguably the aspect of the cosmos or the universe itself which intrinsically limits our knowledge, and whose limiting factors we ought to observe with greater care than we do, and that would be time. As James would know, once you introduce the dimension of time, too much time, into any theoretical model of a sufficient level of complexity and chaos, it tends to ruin the model's efficacy. Sufficiently complex and chaotic scientific models, be they in the natural sciences or social sciences like economics, especially those models which are engaged in making future predictions, tend to fall apart when the time span is expanded too much, especially if that is projected into the future. So our awareness of our limitations with respect to time ought to serve as an important constraint in the implementation of new technologies. Things do generally become less calculable the further you project them out into the future. So it would make sense, for instance, to heighten the evidentiary threshold needed for a particular hypothesis if it entailed great risks in general, but specifically risks which would occur over a long time span or an unknown time span. Think of things like certain chemical waste. We don't know how or if it can be recycled, for instance. And this touches on another one of James's criticisms of this distinction, which is the relativity of this standard or distinction between the calculable and incalculable. I view this relativity as a strength rather than a weakness. Firstly, because reminding ourselves of the importance of this distinction can constrain our actions in conditions of uncertainty by encouraging us to consider our present level of confidence in the context of our past understanding and the limitations that we've encountered therein, and specifically because of the limitations which time ought to place on our level of confidence. So an obvious example here is a principle like equality of opportunity, which is a very modern and recent development. Why would we suppose that people should, irrespective of their birth, have available to them approximately equivalent opportunities in terms of education, what kinds of jobs they can train for? No, it's because we've come to outgrow many of the prejudicial assumptions we made about people based on their parentage or their sex, race, nationality, etc., and have come to realize that the strength of our predictions about a person's future potential is especially weak when you're looking at the first half or perhaps the first quarter of their life. But the constraints which time can and ought to place on our level of confidence doesn't extend only into the future, but also into the past. For instance, a lot of harm has been done in history by people relying upon bad historical accounts, misunderstandings of available historical evidence, propaganda, distortions, etc. So understanding that our predictions about the future are constrained not only by the nonsense which time makes of our theoretical models, but also by our often inadequate and sometimes dangerously inadequate accounts of the past, including the recent past, is incredibly important ethically. If you consider, for instance, the dangers in terms of war, terrorism, cults, and so on, that is affected by disinformation and propaganda today, and you compare the harms which propaganda caused 100 years ago, there doesn't seem to be a lot of progress in terms of how the culture at large processes disinformation and or misinformation. And part of my intuition here connects with a different original idea I have about epistemology and ethics, but perhaps I'll come back to that at a different time. Moving on to our disagreement over the importance of cultivating a loving disposition for enhancing one's rationality. James's general objection was that a loving disposition is not reliably helpful or even compatible with rational decision-making, giving examples of mystics being killed and of the paradoxes of rationality when it comes to circumstances like war. I could also add here interesting examples would be something like closeting. In some societies, it may be rational and or ethical for a gay person to come out. In another society, it may be irrational and or unethical, depending on the context. So I recognize it's important not to idealize one's society or the people more generally. My essential point here, though, is that I think that the dangers of misanthropy are greater than the dangers of accidentally idolizing humanity or one's society through a conflation of rationality with love or a pro-social attitude. Now, specifically, James raised the historical importance of othering as a justification for conflict, war, and other threats to human rights and well-being, both historically and in the present. My fundamental response to this would be that I think that a loving disposition is characteristically non-dual, by which I mean is characterized precisely by the evaporation of a distinction such as self and other, given the psychological openness and associated relaxation of the nerves which a loving disposition entails. And this openness allows one to relate to values on a more personal level, such that one's relating to ideas and values and relating to people are both mutually enhanced. there is what the philosopher John Vervaeke has called a reciprocal opening process, kind of positive feedback loop, and that this opening or openness overcomes alienation in general, including the interpersonal alienation which is referenced by the term othering. So my claim specifically here is that the non-dual awareness, which is characteristic of a loving disposition, resolves this othering, which James is right to highlight as a major historical problem with our ethical decision-making. It overcomes this othering experientially on an emotional and psychological level by the subject perceiving others as being a manifestation of what they perceive to be of value in themselves, or in their own experience more generally. Think of how the relatability of a person, or even the apparent relatability of a person, can enhance our positive feelings toward them, aid in our understanding or in how intelligible we perceive them and their behavior to be. So, I think that this non-dual awareness can and does indeed serve as a more reliable foundation for pro-social attitudes than a more traditionally Kantian, disinterested or abstractly rational sense of duty, which you discover both in the Kantian or deontological ethical tradition and sometimes in the utilitarian or consequentialist tradition, of which James is something of a representative. Best way to understand this intuition of mine is to think about it in the simplest of terms. Think about the relative ease with which you clean the house when you're preparing to have somebody else over, as compared with when you clean the house when you're just doing it for yourself. You may or may not actually value the person more highly than you value yourself, but there is something about the sense of service that can give you a sense of motivation and purpose in what would otherwise seem banal or even negative. So my claim in summary is that the cultivation of a loving disposition undermines the alienation which serves as the fundamental prerequisite, psychological prerequisite for othering in the first place. It thereby renders one's ethical duties less burdensome and increases their overall capacity for ethical behavior. A good way of understanding how love can serve to enhance one's rationality is to consider the role of beauty and beautification. Consider how, for instance, an artistic rendering of information can make it more palatable, whether that is a certain more musical tone of voice, or whether that is the rendering of information in a poem, song, infographic, allegory, or metaphor. The educational system is full of acronyms, metaphors, symbols, and other things precisely because they aid in retention. And a part of that has to do with the beauty, whether that's in terms of humor or elegance or gracefulness of a particular way of formulating information. Specifically, I think metaphor in particular stands out as the beautification of a concept. It's partially why we enjoy music as much as we do, and how we can enjoy lyrics about the most mundane of topics if they are rendered into sufficiently interesting metaphors. And this connects in with Hillman's idea of soul-making and Hillman's observation that we naturally tend to fall in love with what we find beautiful in the world, and caring for what we find beautiful comes naturally to us, whether it's a garden or a cat or a work of art. So it's not just that we beautify things that can aid instrumentally in our retention of a concept. It can also enhance our caring for the information. And so there's a profound link, as far as I'm concerned, between instrumental rationality and caring. Also, having a more beautiful or pleasant feeling inside of ourselves is clearly important for efficiency, which is an aspect of rationality. For instance, if you have, as with urgency, playfulness is something else which can clearly derange our decision-making if it is either in excess or deficiency in a particular context. Think of the extreme excess of playfulness would be something like a Dionysian frenzy, and the other extreme being a kind of grave solemnity in which no fun or joy is allowed. Both extremes, the Dionysian frenzy and the grave solemnity, are not only unfun, but also inefficient due to their excess or deficiency of playfulness. There's a certain playfulness and joyfulness which is intrinsic to functioning effectively in the world. If you ever doubt that, you just have to have a severe experience of clinical depression and watch all the color be stripped from every aspect of life. And the flip side of this relationship between beauty or beautification and caring and efficiency, instrumental rationality, is also true when you consider ugliness. Ugliness has always been a prerequisite for vilification and dehumanization, especially that which precedes violence in general. For instance, it's typical for genocidal discourse for certain groups of people to be referred to as beasts or insects or something else which is regarded as dangerous, disgusting, etc. As there is a link between dehumanization and perceptions of ugliness, there is likewise a link between anthropomorphizing, which is the opposite of dehumanization, and beautification. One of the reasons people tend to love having cats and dogs and feel they can really relate to them is because of how they interpret their behavior anthropomorphically, as if they were a human person. Now, we had a disagreement about the value of faith beyond the realms of superstition and delusion, and the distinctive value of faith and self-fulfilling beliefs as compared with more general hopeful or positive attitudes. James had said in our discussion, quote, "Every reasonable person is not in practice party to all the relevant evidence." My response to that would be that yes, that is true, but not particularly helpful in our present epoch, because there are now, I would claim, counterbalancing our unprecedented level of access to high-quality information. I think there are equally unprecedented time constraints on our decision-making, because our time is one of unprecedentedly rapid and dramatic changes. And I think this historical condition does increase the importance of questions of faith, if not their intrinsic value as such. James had asked, how could you go from lacking evidence and time to assess the relevant evidence to increasing your level of confidence beyond what is justified by the available evidence? That's what he said he didn't understand. Well, my answer to that would be, the obvious answer to that would be, you are forced to increase your confidence beyond the available evidence in certain emergency or crisis situations where you're forced to make a decision with inadequate evidence and inadequate time to process the evidence, and you have to deal with things like instinct and intuitions instead of the higher faculties. You have to contend with emotions like fear and hope, decide how much you're going to let them color your reasoning, and you need to weigh and compare your different hopes and fears. Sometimes the cost-benefit analysis can't be as rational as you would like it to be. It has to involve vaguer sentiments than you would like to use. So the question arises at the very least, in such an emergency or crisis situation for which individuals are unprepared or which takes them by surprise, where do you place your faith? Do you, for instance, place more importance on your hopes or on your fears, or on one particular hope or one particular fear? And your answer to that question, or where you place your faith, will be important for instance, how risk-averse you are. It's important for the attitude which you will formulate in response to the event, even prior to deciding to take a particular course of action. On my understanding, faith is at the very least what you are forced to do when you don't have sufficient evidence to take a decision, but you are forced to take a decision by time constraints and other environmental factors which pertain in your particular circumstance. You're forced to take the decision regardless, and you have to navigate your emotions, instincts, intuitions, and so on. My claim here is very simple, that there are wiser and less wise types of faith, sources of faith, objects of faith, and so on. Before I turn on to the question of souls and soul-making, I'd like to give a practical example of a self-fulfilling belief, which is related to, but not quite the same as a faith-based belief, that I think is clearly instrumentally rational and has a usefulness, and relates back to the discussion I was having previously about dehumanization, ugliness on the one hand, and anthropomorphizing and beautification on the other. One of the ideas developed by Plato in his late works was the notion of the world soul, or anima mundi. The fundamental idea expounded in the Timaeus is that nature is a living entity and simultaneously a god, which possesses a soul of its own distinct nature that is like a human individual soul, but on a cosmic scale. This was an idea which mythopoetically or metaphorically interested Carl Jung as well in his late works, and Carl Jung's controversial student and disciple James Hillman throughout his career, but also especially in his late works. And Hillman was very concerned with the relationship the individuals had to their immediate environment and to objects and other non-human entities in the environment. the importance that this had for the psychology of the individual and the society as a whole. Specifically, Hillman was concerned about an excess of interiorization happening in modern culture. That is, all psychological questions and topics being located locally inside the individual's head, and the world not being seen or understood as a place of subjectivity, of being rendered dead or unrelatable. And Hillman saw the contemporary emphasis on anesthetizing, people desiring to be numb through antidepressants or antipsychotics or meditation or what have you, desire to be free from the pain which one's senses can deliver to them. He saw that as connected with this kind of pathological interiorization and this rejection of the world as a place of soul, which is partially why he envisioned psychology as soul-making, both for the individual and for the society to recover the world as a place of soul. Hillman was particularly concerned as well with the manner in which the modern people had come to regard themselves as possessing an inner child and relating everything back to adolescent or childhood experience, and therefore kinship relations, family relations, parenting relations, etc., along Freudian lines, rather than regarding themselves primarily as citizens. So there were a number of related concerns he had about the depoliticization of psychology and of how we conceive of the subject, along with this anesthetizing or suppression of what Jung would call the sense function, our sensing capabilities, and this lack of a focus on the relationship the individual has to their immediate environment and to the world writ large, both in terms of how they relate to physical spaces and objects, and in terms of how they relate to their conception of the cosmos or of the world itself as a meaningful place. And Hillman developed this thing called the imaginal method, partially as a means of recovering what he saw as psychological values inherent in animistic or other indigenous, pre-modern and specifically pre-Christian cultures. An example of this imaginal method in practice, which is also an instance of anthropomorphizing, would be to do with an old suitcase that I had. Moving between houses, this suitcase was getting really worse for wear, and one of the wheels was partially falling off, and the whole thing just needed to be chucked, but I hadn't gotten around to it yet, and I was leaving the house, and I was carrying this thing, and it was, dragging. It was really annoying. And it's very typical in such a circumstance, people to express frustration and anger toward the object, which is interesting when you think about it, because that's typically how we regard subjects or, living entities which are frustrating our purposes. It doesn't make a lot of sense to be angry at objects. But I took a pause when I was getting frustrated by this, how hard it was for me to drag this thing around. I took a pause and I did a quick little mental shift along Hillmanian lines, using a bit of the imaginal method. I began to treat this suitcase as if it were an older person with an injury for whom I cared. And without adopting any superstitious belief about the soul or the subjectivity of this suitcase, the sheer act of treating it with a greater gentleness calmed me down and enabled me to move it with greater efficiency. So when Hillman talks about imaginal method or recovering the world as a place of soul, anthropomorphizing, that's a good example of the kind of thing which one can do very practically to relate better to the world, including to objects, without experiencing any kind of regression into any form of superstition. Which brings us to James and I's final disagreement over whether we should pursue a reforming conception of soul, or the question more broadly, is the soul the baby in the bathwater which we ought to be afraid of discarding as we move on from traditional religious worldviews? And this brought us on to a discussion of where we should place emphasis. Should we place emphasis on the new and emerging problems associated with technology, versus to what extent do we have to, as James said, conduct a rearguard action against the old problems, which also make the new problems worse? My fundamental response to this is, my fundamental concern here is that I think that the rate of secularization by which we are maturing out of our old superstitions and authoritarian practices is being outpaced by the rate of technological change, which should force us to have a joint focus on both old and new problems But I would argue, and I don't know how much James would sympathize with this, that we ought to place more of an emphasis on the new problems. Because it is precisely our new technical contexts, such as the internet, in which the old problems are manifesting in their worst ways. So old problems, both in the sense of problems that are old to the human psyche, the human character, what Jung called the archaic man, things like dysmorphia or superstition generally, and older problems that are associated with religion, like fundamentalism or scapegoating. Both of these are made worse in the new contexts provided by current technologies. So my argument about pursuing a reformist conception of soul or of soul-making is motivated, because Hillman had his own motivations, but for me, it's partially motivated by what I consider the two dual threats, which I regard as being the most serious of the 21st century. These two dual threats, these meta-problems, I think, which pervade the bigger issues like AI, climate change, and so on, are what I call virtualization, firstly, and class-based speciation, secondly. Now, I only had the time to address the second one in the podcast. I see this first threat as being both more gradual and relevant for the short term, specifically this decade, although I believe virtualization as a process has taken off since the late 20th century. And the second issue of class-based speciation I see as something which will be upon us more suddenly and affect us more over the long term, although I think it's likely to be the early 2030s when that really starts being a major problem. So I've defined virtualization in some of my YouTube shorts as, quoting myself, the substitution of the real for the virtual, symbolic, and performative to the point where the value of reality as such is increasingly lost and ultimately destroyed. So in my view, this process, it's aligned with the idea of simulations, simulated experiences, specifically on the marketplace or in other forms of recreation, replacing real experiences for a variety of reasons, but partly being it's maybe cheaper or more efficient, or at least perceived to be less costly or efficient in the short term. To my view, this started with the substitution of both bargaining and purchasing power among the working classes for greater access to things like mortgages and cheap and easy credit and loans in the late 70s and early 80s, this dawn of the neoliberal era. The reason why that is virtualization is because you go from having greater disposable income relative to your productivity to having what feels like greater purchasing power because of things like credit cards, and what feels like greater economic stability because of things like mortgages. Whereas at the same time, in actuality, your purchasing power is diminished by the attacks on unions and the increasing centralization of productivity gains in the hands of shareholders and employers. And your economic security is also weakened, and especially your children's economic security is weakened by that very same process of the attack on organized labor, leading to worsening labor market conditions, which create institutional biases against not just working class people, but specifically the young, in terms of trying to get access to fixed assets such as houses. So this virtualization process is kind of an amorphous, difficult to define thing. So historically, it started with the onset of the neoliberal era, continued and intensified with so-called free or freemium services that proliferated with the internet in the early 21st century, and is continuing through the so-called sharing economy into the metaverse, which is a kind of secondary meaning to virtualization for me. Virtualization is both a general phenomenon, as I say, the substitution of the real for the virtual, but also refers in my usage to a particular near-term event, which will be what I anticipate as the response of the ruling class to the threat of mass unemployment posed by AI, which is that they will effectively shift workers into the metaverse, the same way they responded to deindustrialization by shifting workers into the service sector. My essential prediction here is that governments will, in collaboration with corporations like Meta, create jobs in the metaverse to keep people employed on relatively low wages, so as to keep the present system functioning, avoid the political and social dangers associated with unemployment, protecting existing market power, etc. So virtualization is a wonderful pretext for maintaining the existing system in the name of social progress and saving the world. The social progress in question would be providing full employment, providing greater educational and other cultural activities for people all around the world through the metaverse, and also reducing the environmental impact of our production activities, because the more we're involved in virtual production, the less we'll be engaged in certain types of unsustainable labor practices. My view is that this virtualization will intensify the existing crisis of meaning, because people will not be truly satiated by virtual experiences when they lack real opportunities for things like travel, greater leisure time. And so virtualization is the greatest danger in the world today for me, even more so than AI itself, because it provides the smokescreen for class-based speciation to occur. That is, the translation of existing structural advantages, such as market power, physical and digital capital, and of course the digital capital here being especially important. Those who own the metaverse will have an information, power, and economic asymmetry even more gargantuan than it presently is for major shareholders of Amazon or Facebook. So class-based speciation is the translation of existing structural advantages like market power, physical and digital capital, especially digital capital, what the economist Varoufakis calls cloud capital, into effectively irreversible genetic advantages bought through earlier access to high-cost AI-fueled augmentation. Speciation results from this process, as in every other animal species, when the resultant social classes either avoid or become incapable of interbreeding. And as I mentioned in the podcast, this has certainly an ideological precedent in forms of racialism associated with colonial narratives of supremacy developed in the early modern era. And of course, a more recent precedent in the Nazi attempt at the construction of a so-called master race during the Second World War, so less than 100 years ago. This threat of class-based rather than racially-based speciation is even more dangerous for me precisely because it lacks this racialist element, so it will be more politically palatable to a lot of people. In this hypothetical, what I believe to be likely historical scenario, which I'm laying out, genetic and economic advantages would quickly become mutually reinforcing, dramatically undermining the existing basis for social mobility and social cohesion more generally. Such a situation is, in my view, likely to eventuate in our lifetime, given historical precedents like racialism and fascism, and classism most particularly, combined with likely breakthroughs in medicine owing to AI, and the oligarchic, and certainly in countries like the United States, increasingly plutocratic nature of the present system. Ours is a world in which the two great superpowers are a plutocracy in the case of the US, and a totalitarian surveillance state in the case of China. The moral seriousness of the threat of speciation for me is that it would constitute, for those engaging in speciation, a conscious attempt to remove oneself from not just our shared genetic inheritance, but also our shared human jurisdiction and our increasingly shared understanding of human rights. So this is why I believe that the soul question is a worthier one than the God question, given the cumulative threats posed to the human condition and the very integrity of the species by the present rate of technological change. Assuming, as I do, that there is no soul as traditionally understood by the mainstream religions, the most concrete pragmatic basis for the equal consideration of human interests, the universal and equal consideration of human interests, is our shared genetic inheritance. It is this genetic inheritance which makes us as mutually intelligible as we in fact are, as relatively predictable, at least at certain phases of life as we are. There are certain healthcare and educational needs which people in a certain age cohort need, it's people in another age cohort need, etc. And it is what makes cooperation between us as individuals and as societies, civilizations, it's what makes that cooperation as instrumentally rational as it is, and what makes us capable of regarding each other as equally worthy, at least in the abstract and on the population level. This rational and objective basis for the universal recognition of a shared humanity was only placed on such a firm basis very recently with the establishment of contemporary, not even modern science, but 20th century science. to a large extent, even 21st century science, if you consider how recent genetics is as a science. This rational and objective basis for the universal recognition of a shared humanity, only placed on such a firm basis very recently, is now under unprecedented threat from prospects like, to give some examples, identity theft, cybercrime, AI mis- and disinformation, and class-based speciation. And I regard this last one, class-based speciation, as the most serious, partially because, unlike previous and other examples we could give, the prospect of class-based speciation would by necessity be a structural, societal, and global collective action problem. Depending on one's politics, one can argue that the present capitalist system is more or less meritocratic. Supporters would say it's very meritocratic. Critics would say it is not meritocratic enough. Radical critics would say that it is not very meritocratic at all. But in any case, the meritocratic element of the system is partially the biological equality between workers and employers, or between, even more extremely, major shareholders and people who are unemployed or from disadvantaged backgrounds. The fact that a 20-year-old is a 20-year-old, a 40-year-old is a 40-year-old, an 80-year-old is an 80-year-old, etc., in spite of things like our differential access to healthcare, it does create a certain real-world equality of opportunity between different cohorts, at least at certain stages of people's career development and so on. But if, via class-based speciation, we split off into subspecies with radically different lifespans, health spans, and neurophysiology more generally, we would lose this de facto basis for the equal consideration of human interests, and principles like the rule of law and equality of opportunity would be more radically and rapidly undermined even than they are presently being in this period of internet-enabled panicky, where we all share the one jurisdiction of the internet, and yet we all live in different jurisdictions, so we all have different rights and protections with regard to both our bio-self and our data self. Another reason soul-making is worth considering is we don't actually have anything like a soul to differentiate human persons, evolved human persons, from either a simulated consciousness or a truly sentient AI. So if we don't have anything to differentiate ourselves, apart perhaps from something like genetics, which could be a problem for reasons I've already referenced, it might make sense to create something which marks us or helps us comprehend each other as distinctively valuable as compared with other forms of human life. It's my view that that regulatory and other political responses to these dual threats of virtualization and class-based speciation are likely to prove inadequate given the timescale in question, given how fast I anticipate these changes to happen, essentially over the next 10 years. Therefore, we ought to consider creating souls as a safeguard against threats such as these, that is, somehow identifying, cultivating, and integrating with technology whatever it is which binds us together as uniquely valuable both as individuals and as a collective, even if, and I would say especially if, such a thing does not yet exist, or has never existed. Psychology should become, as James Hillman phrased it, soul-making, and our politics should follow suit. The soul, on this view, is the proverbial baby in the bathwater of the religious heritage, rather than God. And I suppose I should speak a little bit more about what I mean by soul here. Very practical question, why not just say perspective? The unique individual perspective, or the human perspective, as compared with the perspective of other forms of life. Part of the answer to this was provided by James Hillman. One of the characteristics he ascribed to his, to use James Fodor's terms, reforming conception of soul, was that soul-making, or our soulful experiences or soulful encounters, derive their significance from what Hillman called their, quote, special relationship with death. Reading from Hillman more, he said, quote, "Because it is in regard to death that the perspective of soul is distinguished most starkly from the perspective of natural life." Now this is very interesting. There is an aspect of our being which is immortal in the sense that it extends beyond any individual, and it extends into history. And this immortal, quote-unquote, aspect of us is also related to concerns we have about what events mean for our death, or rather, our legacy after life, is another way of putting it. Of course, so this just taking a step back, this metaphorical use of the term immortal is where Hillman's conception of soul is contiguous with the religious notions. Where it's discontinuous is that, in this secular sense, soul is referring to an innate potential which is emergent, analogous to genomic potential and how that develops over a person's lifespan, or indeed analogous to personality or some other innate property which develops. So it's less of an absolute conception than religious ideas of soul would imply. And it's not connected with a particular religious cosmology, in spite of Hillman's sympathies for Platonic mythology, and I'll put that to a side for now. Now, James Fodor in our conversation said, I would be inclined to describe what you're talking about as soul as something like a self, And indeed, is the self not something which extends beyond the individual? And, you have a relationship with yourself, and you also have relationships with other people, and they have a different impression of yourself as compared with the relationship you have to yourself. And indeed, you have an impact on history and the world, a relationship with history and the world, both in life and in death. But again, I think the emergence of the cybersphere and the division of the individual into bioself and data self, the fact that it is no longer optional, to some extent even possible, for an individual to be a private citizen or to choose whether or not to have a public persona or public presence. The emergence of the cybersphere and the subsequent splitting of the subject into the data self and bioself, the former playing a major role in regulating the latter, if you think of how you cultivate your resume over your lifespan, how that resume is shared around digitally, how it enables networking opportunities, and so on. This, I think, makes the imperative of soul-making, or, as I say, identifying the aspects of our individual subjectivity which make us uniquely valuable when considered as a whole, and when is considered as individuals, a more urgent priority. Partially for the practical reason I mentioned of differentiating people from simulations, and either AIs which appear to be sentient or AIs which are sentient, but also for its political value of providing somehow a firmer basis for the equal and universal consideration of human interests. If our existing basis for that universal recognition and consideration of equal interests, that is to say our shared genetic inheritance, is threatened by things like class-based speciation. My interest in soul-making, both as Hillman defines it and in my science-fictional creative sense of the term, my original interpretation of Hillman's corpus on this matter, is inspired by the view that political responses, including radical political responses, are unlikely to prove adequate given the time frame. And my response to James's concern that of the traditional connotations which the term soul has would be that I think that there are certain concepts that are just too valuable for secularists or atheists to abandon to the religious idea. I would not want to abandon an idea like the soul any more than I'd like to abandon meditation or Platonic philosophy or anything else, or even traditional Islamic or Christian art, just because of its religious associations in the past. I think it's too valuable a thing to be discarded. And if we find ourselves having superstitious or other religious assumptions being made about subjectivity, or indeed about our so-called reforming conception of the soul, then so be it. Let's unearth and encounter those assumptions. What Hillman often referred to as monotheistic assumptions embedded in modern, avowedly secular culture. Better to confront those and face them than suppress them, I think. So hopefully that provided some clarification and an interesting addition to James and I's conversation. Again, I'd like to thank James Fodor for coming on, and you for listening. Apologies for the delay, and I'll see you all next time.